Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Perhaps the day has left you restless, or maybe you simply find comfort drifting away while contemplating the mysteries of forgotten civilizations. Either way, tonight's journey takes us to the cloud-wrapped peaks of the Peruvian Andes, to a moment when the modern world encountered something extraordinary. You don't need to do anything now but settle in. Let your shoulders drop, allow your breathing to find its natural rhythm, and feel the weight of the day begin to lift. Tonight we walk alongside an explorer named Hiram Bingham as he makes his way through dense jungle growth toward ruins that would change how the world understood an ancient empire. A citadel carved from living stone, terraces that seem to grow from the mountainside itself, and mysteries that remain unsolved even now, more than a century after that July morning in 1911. If these quiet explorations bring you peace, consider liking or subscribing. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy mind at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin our descent into history. The air carried a different quality in Peru at the dawn of the 20th century. Thin at altitude, yes, demanding that lungs work harder for every breath. But it held something else too, something less tangible. Possibility hung thick as morning mist in the valleys, whispered through the leaves of trees that clung to impossible slopes, drifted with the smoke from cooking fires in mountain villages where Quechua-speaking families maintained traditions stretching back centuries. For certain kinds of people, those drawn to mysteries and driven by curiosity that borders on obsession, Peru in 1911 represented the edge of the known world. Beyond lay questions without answers, stories without endings, stones arranged by hands long turned to dust. Hiram Bingham stood on that edge, 35 years old and acutely aware of time's passage. He was a lecturer in Latin American history at Yale University, a position that carried modest prestige but limited resources. His colleagues studied their subjects through documents, through the careful analysis of texts written by chroniclers and preserved in libraries. Bingham had done that work too. He had spent countless hours in Yale's collections, poring over Spanish colonial accounts, reading about the conquest of the Inca Empire, piecing together fragmentary information about a civilization that had thrived for perhaps a century before being violently disrupted by European invasion. But reading about a place, no matter how scholarly the approach, differs vastly from standing in that place. Bingham had learned this truth during his first expedition to South America in 1908. That journey had been relatively modest in scope. He had attended the first Pan-American Scientific Congress in Santiago, Chile, presenting a paper and networking with scholars from across the hemisphere. The formal academic work had proceeded as expected, but what happened afterward changed everything. A local official, impressed by Bingham's genuine interest in South American history, suggested he visit the ruins of Choqquequirau before returning to the United States. Choqquequirau sat high in the Peruvian mountains, days of difficult travel from the nearest city. The site had been known to locals for generations, though few outsiders bothered to make the journey. Those who did often focused on treasure hunting rather than archaeological study. The Inca Empire had possessed substantial wealth, gold and silver worked into objects both functional and ceremonial. When the Spanish conquered the empire, much of that wealth had been melted down and shipped to Europe. But legends persisted of hidden caches, of temples where precious metals still gleamed in darkness, waiting for someone bold enough or fortunate enough to discover them. Bingham wasn't primarily interested in gold. His fascination ran deeper than material wealth. He wanted to understand how a civilization functioned, how it organized itself, how it adapted to challenging environments. The Inca had built an empire spanning thousands of miles along the spine of South America, from modern Ecuador down through Peru and into Bolivia and Chile. They had done this without the wheel, without draft animals larger than llamas, without iron tools or a written language as Europeans understood the term. Yet they had constructed roads that rivaled Rome's in extent and durability. They had engineered agricultural systems that fed millions. They had built structures that still stood centuries after their construction, while Spanish colonial buildings had often crumbled. The trek to Choqquequirau in 1908 had tested Bingham's physical limits. The trail climbed relentlessly, switchbacking up mountainsides where a misstep could mean a fatal fall. The air grew thin enough that every step required conscious effort. At night, temperatures plummeted, making sleep difficult despite exhaustion. Food was simple and often insufficient. Insects bit without mercy. And yet, when Bingham finally stood among the ruins of Choqquequirau, all the hardship felt justified. The sight was magnificent. Terraces carved into the mountainside. Buildings constructed from precisely fitted stones. Water channels that still functioned after centuries. The location itself was breathtaking, perched on a ridge with valleys falling away on all sides, mountains rising beyond to heights where snow persisted year-round. But what struck Bingham most profoundly was the sense of discovery. Standing in Choqquequirau, he could imagine the Inca inhabitants going about their daily routines. Farmers tending crops on those terraces. Priests performing ceremonies in those temples. Children playing in those plazas. The stones held memory, even if they couldn't speak. And Bingham, trained to extract meaning from evidence, felt himself beginning to hear what those stones were trying to communicate. History wasn't just words on a page. It was places and objects. It was landscape and architecture. It was the choices people made about where to live and how to organize their communities. He returned to Yale energized but also frustrated. How much more remained undiscovered? The Spanish had written about many Inca sites, but their accounts were often vague or contradictory. Colonial chroniclers had their own agendas, their own biases. They might describe a location as being near a certain landmark without providing measurements. They might call a city large without specifying how large. Archaeological study could potentially correct these ambiguities, could provide the kind of detailed, verifiable information that historians valued. But such study required money, time, equipment, and institutional support. Bingham spent the next 3 years working to assemble those resources. He published accounts of his 1908 journey, including a book titled Across South America that appeared in 1909. The book did reasonably well, attracting favorable reviews and bringing Bingham's work to a broader audience. More importantly, it demonstrated to potential sponsors that he could complete an expedition, survive the hardships, and produce scholarly results. Yale University took note. So did the National Geographic Society, a relatively young organization eager to support exploration and discovery. By 1911, Bingham had secured funding for what he called the Yale Peruvian Expedition. The stated objective was to search for Vilcabamba, the lost capital of the Neo-Inca state. After the Spanish conquered Cusco in 1533, some Inca nobles had retreated into the mountains, establishing a new capital from which they resisted foreign control. This resistance continued for decades, a thorn in the side of Spanish colonial authorities. Eventually, the Spanish tracked down and eliminated the leadership of this rebel state, but the exact location of Vilcabamba remained unclear. Spanish accounts mentioned it, but provided insufficient detail for later scholars to pinpoint its location with confidence. Finding Vilcabamba would be a significant achievement, Bingham knew. It would answer questions that had puzzled historians for centuries. But beneath that official goal lay a deeper, less easily articulated motivation. Bingham sensed there were secrets in the Peruvian mountains beyond what Spanish chronicles had recorded. The Inca had built extensively, creating structures throughout their empire. Some of these had been documented. Others remained unknown, swallowed by jungle or simply too remote for outsiders to reach. What might those undiscovered sites reveal about Inca civilization? What stories might they tell? The expedition team was small, carefully chosen for complementary skills. Harry Foote, a Yale chemistry professor and Bingham's close friend, would handle scientific observations and analysis. The two men had known each other for years, had a comfortable working relationship built on mutual respect. Foote brought a practical mindset that balanced Bingham's sometimes over-enthusiastic approach to exploration. Isaiah Bowman, a trained geographer, would map the terrain they covered, creating detailed records that would allow others to follow in their footsteps. Kai Hendrickson, serving as naturalist, would document the remarkable biodiversity of the Andes and the transition zones where mountain ecosystems met Amazonian rainforest. Dr. William Irving joined as the expedition surgeon, a necessity given the dangers inherent in their work. At high altitude, even minor injuries could become serious if infected. Tropical diseases lurked in warmer valleys. Venomous snakes inhabited the undergrowth. Having someone trained in medicine was not mere precaution but essential planning. The team also included several other members whose expertise would prove valuable as circumstances demanded. And they would hire local guides and porters along the way, men who knew the trails and spoke the indigenous languages still used throughout rural Peru. Funding, while secured, was modest. Yale and the National Geographic Society had provided enough money to mount a serious expedition, but Bingham couldn't afford extravagance. Every dollar had to be justified, every expense carefully considered. This meant traveling light, relying on local resources where possible, and accepting discomfort as a routine part of the work. No luxury accommodations awaited them in the mountains. No restaurants served familiar food. They would sleep in tents or under the stars. They would eat whatever could be purchased from farmers or shot for the pot. They would walk until their feet blistered and then walk further. The team departed New York in June 1911, boarding a steamship bound for South America. The voyage itself took weeks, the ship making its way south along the Atlantic coast before rounding Cape Horn and heading north into the Pacific. Bingham used this time to review his notes, to refine his plans, to prepare himself mentally for what lay ahead. He had learned from his previous journey that physical preparation mattered, but mental readiness was equally important. There would be moments of extreme frustration. There would be days when nothing went as planned. There would be the temptation to give up, to return to the comfortable certainty of library research. Success would require persistence in the face of repeated setbacks. The ship docked at Melendo on Peru's southern coast, a port town where cargo was loaded and unloaded with the frenetic energy characteristic of such places. From Melendo, the expedition took a train inland, climbing steadily as the tracks followed a route engineered to navigate mountain passes. This railroad was itself an engineering marvel, threading through terrain that seemed determined to defeat human ambition. The train moved slowly, laboriously, its engine straining against the gradient. Outside the windows, the landscape changed from coastal desert to highland plateau, the vegetation shifting, the air growing cooler and thinner. Cusco, their initial destination, sat at an elevation of approximately 3,400 meters above sea level. At that height, the air holds significantly less oxygen than at sea level. Visitors arriving from lower elevations often experience altitude sickness, symptoms including headache, nausea, shortness of breath, and difficulty sleeping. The human body can adapt to high altitude, but adaptation takes time. Bingham and his team would need to spend days acclimatizing before attempting to push even higher into the mountains. Cusco itself rewarded patience. The city had served as the capital of the Inca Empire during that civilization's peak, and traces of that glorious past remained everywhere. The Spanish had built extensively after their conquest, constructing churches and administrative buildings that reflected European architectural traditions. But they had often built on Inca foundations, incorporating the earlier stonework into their colonial structures. The result was a visual palimpsest, layers of history visible in a single wall. At the base, Inca masonry, stones fitted together with such precision that mortar was unnecessary. Above, Spanish construction, cruder in technique but imposing in scale, asserting the dominance of the new order. Walking through Cusco's streets felt like walking through time itself. Every block offered evidence of different eras, different cultures, different visions of how human beings should organize their communities. The Inca had built with an eye toward permanence and harmony with landscape. Their walls followed natural contours, their city plan accommodated the surrounding topography. The Spanish, by contrast, imposed grid patterns that ignored terrain, that asserted human dominion over nature. Both approaches had their logic, their aesthetic appeal, their strengths and weaknesses. Bingham spent his first days in Cusco gathering information. He met with local scholars, men who had devoted their lives to studying the region's history. They shared what they knew about Inca sites in the surrounding area, about rumors of undiscovered ruins, about the challenges of working in such difficult terrain. Some were generous with their knowledge. Others were protective, worried that foreign researchers would extract Peru's heritage without giving proper credit or compensation. Bingham tried to be respectful, to demonstrate that his interests were scholarly rather than exploitative, but he knew skepticism would follow him regardless of his intentions. He also met with church officials who maintained Cusco's colonial-era buildings. These priests and administrators often possessed detailed knowledge of local history, having access to documents and archives that might not be publicly available. One priest showed Bingham a chronicle written by Antonio de la Calancha, an Augustinian friar whose work had been published in 1631. Calancha's text mentioned several Inca sites, including one called Vitcos, described as being near a great white rock over a spring of fresh water. This specific detail caught Bingham's attention. Spanish chroniclers were often frustratingly vague in their geographical descriptions, but this account provided something concrete, a landmark that might be recognizable even centuries later. Bingham also spoke with merchants who traveled throughout the region, buying and selling goods in rural markets. These merchants knew the trails, knew which areas were accessible and which were too dangerous or remote. They spoke of ruins scattered throughout the mountains, some substantial, others little more than foundation stones. Many of these sites had local names in Quechua, the language the Inca had used and which their descendants still spoke. The Spanish names, assigned during the colonial period, often differed from these indigenous designations, creating confusion in historical records. One evening, over a meal of local specialties that Bingham's digestive system struggled to accept, a Cusco official mentioned a prospector's offhand comment. This prospector, a man who spent his time searching for mineral deposits in remote areas, had once remarked about ruins at a place called Machu Picchu. Old Peak, the name meant in Quechua. The prospector hadn't been particularly impressed, having seen many ruins in his wanderings. But he'd said these ruins were extensive, covering a mountain ridge, with many buildings and terraces. The official who relayed this information didn't seem to think it significant. Ruins were common in the region. The Inca had built everywhere. But Bingham noted it down, adding Machu Picchu to his mental map of potential sites worth investigating. As July arrived, Bingham felt ready to begin fieldwork in earnest. The expedition had organized its supplies, hired mules for transport, and identified potential guides. The plan was to follow the Urubamba River northwest from Cusco, a route that would take them through spectacular gorge country. The river had carved deep into the mountains over millions of years, creating a valley where tropical weather patterns from the Amazon basin collided with high-altitude conditions. This meeting of climate zones produced remarkable biodiversity and also posed challenges for travelers. Altitude would vary dramatically depending on precisely where you were. Weather could change within minutes, sunny skies giving way to torrential rain that turned trails to mud and made river crossings treacherous. The expedition departed Cusco on July 19, 1911. The morning was clear, the air crisp with the kind of coldness that comes at high altitude, where distance from the equator matters less than distance from sea level. Mules carried their equipment: tents, cooking supplies, scientific instruments, cameras and photographic plates, notebooks and measuring tools. The animals picked their way along paths that had been used for centuries, possibly for millennia. These trails represented accumulated wisdom, the combined experience of countless travelers who had discovered through trial and error the safest routes through difficult terrain. The first leg of their journey took them northwest toward the town of Limatambo, following a path that descended gradually from Cusco's elevation. The landscape shifted as they traveled, moving from the relatively dry conditions around Cusco into areas where moisture increased, where vegetation grew more lush. They passed through small communities where Quechua-speaking families farmed terraced fields, using techniques inherited from their Inca ancestors. These terraces were engineered with remarkable sophistication, with drainage systems that prevented erosion and soil degradation. Some had been in continuous use for centuries. Bingham found himself studying everything with an observer's intensity. The way houses were constructed, the crops being cultivated, the animals being raised, the tools being used. He was trying to understand how modern Andean communities related to their pre-Columbian past. How much cultural continuity existed? How much had been disrupted by Spanish colonization? These weren't abstract academic questions. Understanding present-day practices could provide insights into historical ones. If modern farmers use certain terrace designs, might those designs reflect Inca engineering principles? If contemporary weavers created textiles with specific patterns, might those patterns echo older artistic traditions? The expedition pushed on, maintaining a steady but not exhausting pace. Rushing at high altitude accomplished nothing except depleting energy reserves and risking injury. Better to move deliberately, to give their bodies time to adjust to exertion in thin air, to conserve strength for the more challenging sections ahead. They camped each night where suitable locations presented themselves, places with access to water and relatively level ground. Evening meals were simple but sufficient, local food supplemented with supplies they'd brought from Cusco. On July 22, they reached Ollantaytambo, a town of considerable historical importance. Like Cusco, Ollantaytambo showed clear evidence of Inca construction. Terraces climbed the mountainsides. Stone buildings incorporated precise masonry. And there was a fortress, partially ruined but still impressive, its walls built from stone so large that modern engineers would struggle to move them without mechanical equipment. The Inca had possessed sophisticated knowledge of leverage, of physics, of materials. They had understood how to shape stone, how to transport enormous blocks, how to position them with precision. Bingham wanted to spend more time examining Ollantaytambo's ruins, but the calendar pressed forward. They had limited time before Peruvian winter weather would make mountain travel even more dangerous than usual. They needed to cover as much ground as possible during the current window of opportunity. So after a brief rest and resupply in Ollantaytambo, the expedition continued, following the Urubamba River downstream as it flowed northward through increasingly dramatic gorge country. The river itself was a powerful presence, its waters running swift and cold, fed by snowmelt from peaks that rose to heights where nothing grew. The Urubamba's name came from Quechua words meaning flat land of spiders, though Bingham found little flat land along most of the route. The valley walls rose steeply, sometimes nearly vertical, covered with vegetation that clung to seemingly impossible slopes. Trees grew at angles, their roots somehow finding purchase in shallow soil. Vines draped like natural curtains. Orchids bloomed in bursts of color against the overwhelming green. The trail, such as it was, alternated between narrow paths carved into the hillside and sections where travel required wading through the river itself or clambering over boulder fields. This was slow, often frustrating work. mules balked at dangerous passages, requiring patient coaxing. Equipment needed constant checking to ensure nothing had been damaged or lost. The photographers worried incessantly about their fragile glass plates, knowing that a single slip could destroy irreplaceable images. They passed through tiny settlements, collections of a few houses where families lived in near isolation, farming small plots and raising chickens, guinea pigs, and the occasional pig. These families were invariably gracious, offering what hospitality they could despite their limited resources. Bingham was moved by their generosity, by the way they shared food with strangers who appeared without warning in their remote communities. He tried to compensate them fairly, paying in silver coins for supplies and information. And he asked questions. Always questions. Had they seen ruins in the area? Did they know of Inca sites that weren't commonly visited? The answers varied. Some families knew of nearby ruins. Others had heard stories but couldn't provide specific locations. Still others seemed puzzled by the question, as if wondering why anyone would care about old stones when there was work to be done, fields to tend, lives to live. On the evening of July 23, the expedition reached Mandaya Pampa, where the river called Mandaya joined the Urubamba. Here they found a more substantial settlement, a place where workers were building bridges and maintaining the rough road that ran along the river. This road existed because of a growing interest in the region's potential for agriculture, particularly sugar cane cultivation. Entrepreneurs were beginning to establish haciendas in the warmer, low-elevation areas where tropical crops could thrive. These developments required infrastructure, which meant workers, which meant small communities in places that had previously been nearly uninhabited by anyone except the occasional farmer or prospector. The expedition made camp near Mandaya Pampa as day faded into night. The air was warmer here than it had been in Cusco, the elevation having dropped considerably during their journey down the Urubamba Gorge. Insects sang in the gathering darkness. The river's constant rush provided a white noise backdrop. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, its voice strange and almost mechanical. Bingham sat near the campfire, reviewing his notes by lamplight. They had covered good distance since leaving Cusco, but they were still searching for clear leads on significant ruins. They had documented several smaller sites, places where Inca construction was evident but not particularly extensive. These were worth recording, worth photographing and measuring. Each piece of evidence contributed to the larger puzzle of how the Inca had organized their empire, how they had utilized the diverse environments available to them. But Bingham hungered for something more substantial, for a discovery that would justify the expedition's expense and effort. Morning came with mist rising from the river, wisps of moisture that caught the early light and glowed briefly before dissipating in the warming air. The expedition had no particular destination planned for this day, July 24th. They would continue exploring the general area around Mandaya Pampa, asking questions, investigating any leads that emerged. It was patient work, the kind that could prove tedious but which occasionally yielded remarkable results. As the team was preparing breakfast, a man approached their camp. He was a local, a campesino whose family farmed in the area. His name was Melchor Artiega, and he had heard that foreigners were looking for ruins. He might, he suggested, know of a place that would interest them. There were old buildings, many of them, on a mountain ridge above the river. The place was called Machu Picchu, after the taller of two peaks that flanked the site. Bingham's interest sharpened immediately. This was the name he had heard mentioned back in Cusco, the prospector's casual comment about extensive ruins. He questioned Artiega carefully. How far was this site? How difficult was the access? What condition were the ruins in? Artiega's answers were encouraging. The site was perhaps 2 hours away, though the trail was steep and could be dangerous, especially if rain had made things slippery. As for the ruins, he thought they were in reasonable condition. Some buildings had collapsed, but many remained standing. And there were terraces, many terraces, covering the mountainside. Would Arteaga be willing to guide them there? For a price, certainly. They negotiated briefly and agreed on a sol, the Peruvian currency, as payment. It was a modest sum, but Arteaga seemed satisfied. He would take them to Machu Picchu that very day if they wished. Bingham consulted with his team. Should they all go, or just a small group? They decided that Bingham would go with Arteaga, accompanied by Sergeant Carrasco, a Peruvian soldier who had been assigned to the expedition as a military escort and who had proven himself capable and reliable. The route began by following the river downstream for a short distance. The roar of the Urubamba filled the air, water rushing over and around boulders, creating rapids and whirlpools. The power of the river was impressive and intimidating. During certain seasons, the water rose even higher, making passage impossible, cutting off communities on either side until flood conditions subsided. They came to a place where a crude bridge crossed the river. To call it a bridge was perhaps generous. It consisted of logs lashed together with vines and rope, spanning the gap between boulders that protruded from the riverbed. The structure swayed under their weight as they crossed, one person at a time, stepping carefully on the slickwood. Below, the river churned white and furious. A fall would likely be fatal, the current strong enough to batter a person against rocks before sweeping them downstream. Bingham focused on each step, resisting the urge to look down, keeping his eyes on the far side where solid ground waited. Once across, Arteaga led them up. The trail, if it could be called that, was little more than a series of rough stairs carved into the near-vertical mountainside, augmented by makeshift ladders where the slope proved too steep even for steps. Vegetation crowded close, branches reaching out to snag clothing, roots waiting to trip the unwary. The air grew warmer as they climbed, the morning sun now fully illuminating the gorge, and Bingham found himself sweating despite the exertion being necessary to generate body heat in the thin atmosphere. The climb demanded concentration. Each handhold needed testing to ensure it would support weight. Each foothold needed placement with care to avoid slipping. Bingham's legs burned from the effort, his lungs worked hard to extract oxygen from air that seemed perpetually insufficient. He had to remind himself to maintain a steady rhythm, not to rush, to let his body find its pace. Arteaga moved with the ease of someone who had made this climb many times, who knew which routes were reliable and which were treacherous. Carrasco, younger and in excellent physical condition, managed well despite the challenging terrain. They climbed for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 90 minutes. The height gained was substantial, the river below diminishing to a ribbon of white visible through gaps in the forest canopy. Eventually, the trail leveled somewhat, following the contour of the mountain ridge. And then they began encountering terraces. These weren't like the agricultural terraces Bingham had seen elsewhere in Peru, though they shared similar construction principles. These terraces were built on a massive scale, cut into the mountain with a precision that suggested master engineers had planned every detail. Stone retaining walls held back tons of earth, creating level planting surfaces where crops could grow despite the impossibly steep underlying slope. The stonework was characteristic Inca, blocks fitted together with minimal mortar, relying on precise shaping to create stable structures. But what struck Bingham most immediately was the condition of these terraces. They were overgrown, certainly, covered with vegetation that had taken root in the centuries since they'd been actively maintained. But they were fundamentally intact. The retaining walls stood firm. The drainage system still functioned, channeling water away to prevent erosion. These structures had been built to endure, and endure they had. Arteaga said something in Spanish, gesturing up the slope. There was more above, much more. Bingham's pulse quickened. The scales suggested this wasn't a minor outpost or way station. This was something significant, something that had required enormous labor and sophisticated planning to construct. They continued climbing, past terrace after terrace, until suddenly buildings came into view. Stone structures with characteristic Inca features, trapezoidal doorways and windows, walls that curved inward slightly as they rose, roofs long since collapsed but walls still standing. The buildings were half hidden by vegetation, trees growing from what had once been plazas, vines crawling over walls, moss covering stones. But the architecture was unmistakable. And there were people. A family lived here, farmers who had claimed some of the ancient terraces and were growing crops in the fertile soil. They looked up in surprise as Bingham and his companions emerged from the trail. Arteaga called out a greeting, explaining in Quechua that these strangers wanted to see the old buildings. The family consisted of 2 men, Richard and Alvarez, along with their wives and children. They had been living at the site for several years, Arteaga explained, farming the terraces and occasionally selling produce to travelers along the river below. The farmers were friendly, welcoming the visitors with the natural hospitality that seemed characteristic of rural Peruvians. They offered water and a place to rest. One of the children, a boy perhaps 11 years old named Pablito, volunteered to show them around. He knew the site well, having explored every section in the way curious children do. He would take them to the most impressive buildings, he promised, to the temple and the tower. Bingham could hardly believe his fortune. Not only had Arteaga guided them to substantial ruins, but here was a local resident eager to provide a tour. He accepted the offer gratefully, and Pablito set off with the enthusiasm of youth, leading them deeper into the site along paths only he seemed to recognize through the dense undergrowth. The site revealed itself gradually, each turn in the path exposing new structures, new evidence of sophisticated planning and execution. Bingham's mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand the scale and significance. This wasn't a small settlement. This was a complex of considerable size, with multiple distinct areas that suggested different functions. Pablito led them first to what appeared to be a residential sector. Buildings clustered together, their walls still standing to various heights. Some retained only foundation courses, low walls barely visible beneath aggressive vegetation. Others stood nearly complete, missing only their thatched roofs which had rotted away centuries ago. The stonework varied in quality from building to building. Some structures featured the finest Inca masonry, blocks shaped so precisely that even a knife blade couldn't slip between adjacent stones. Other buildings used rougher construction, field stones fitted together with mud mortar. This variation suggested a social hierarchy, with better buildings reserved for higher status residents. The doorways were characteristic of Inca architecture, trapezoidal in shape, wider at the base than at the top. This design had both aesthetic and structural benefits. The inward-leaning walls created an optical illusion that made the buildings appear taller than they actually were. More importantly, the shape provided superior earthquake resistance. The Andes are seismically active, earthquakes common enough that any building tradition needed to account for them. The trapezoidal design distributed stress effectively, allowing walls to flex slightly during tremors without collapsing. Bingham stopped frequently to examine details. Stone pegs protruded from walls in patterns that suggested they had supported horizontal beams, probably wooden poles that in turn held up the roof structure. Niches were carved into walls, small alcoves that might have held ceremonial objects or simply served as convenient storage. The floors in many buildings showed evidence of having been carefully leveled, packed earth surface smooth despite the underlying mountain slope. Windows were positioned deliberately, not randomly. Many faced east, toward the rising sun. This orientation had ceremonial significance for the Inca, who revered the sun as a primary deity. But it also had practical benefits. Morning sun would warm buildings that had cooled overnight at this altitude, where temperatures could drop near freezing even during what passed for summer in the southern hemisphere. The windows were small, limiting heat loss while still admitting light. In a culture without glass, this represented sensible environmental design. They moved through the residential sector and entered what Pablito called the main plaza, a large open space that had been leveled with tremendous effort. Creating flat ground on a mountain ridge required either cutting into the slope or building up with fill, and often both. The Inca had done this throughout their empire, creating ceremonial spaces, agricultural lands, building platforms. The labor involved was staggering. Thousands of workers must have participated in constructing this site, moving earth and stone, cutting and shaping blocks, positioning massive stones without cranes or machinery. The plaza offered spectacular views. On one side, the ridge dropped away nearly vertically to the river far below. Beyond rose mountains, peak after peak extending to the horizon, their slopes a patchwork of vegetation zones determined by altitude and exposure. The sky was immense, clouds building in the way they did most afternoons in this climate, moisture rising from the Amazon basin and condensing as it met cooler air at elevation. Adjacent to the plaza stood one of the most impressive structures on the site. 3 walls formed the basis of a building, but one wall featured 3 enormous windows, trapezoidal like all Inca windows but dramatically larger than those in ordinary buildings. The stonework was exceptional, blocks fitted so precisely that Bingham couldn't slip even a thin blade between them. This was clearly a structure of great importance, possibly a temple given its position and construction quality. Pablito confirmed that this was indeed considered a temple by the local farmers. The Temple of the 3 Windows, they called it. Standing inside, looking out through those massive openings, Bingham felt a visceral connection to the past. People had stood in this exact spot centuries ago, looking out at these same mountains, participating in ceremonies whose nature could only be guessed at now. What rituals had been performed here? What prayers offered? What beliefs had driven the construction of this place? He pulled out his notebook, trying to capture details that would help him remember and later describe what he was witnessing. The dimensions of the temple, approximate measurements that would need to be verified with proper surveying equipment. The number of buildings visible from this vantage point. The orientation of structures relative to cardinal directions. The style of masonry in different sections. Every detail mattered, every observation potentially significant. Carrasco, meanwhile, was taking photographs. He had the difficult task of capturing images in conditions far from ideal. The lighting varied dramatically as clouds moved across the sun. The overgrown vegetation made it hard to frame shots that clearly showed architectural features. And there was the constant concern about the fragile glass photographic plates, each one irreplaceable, each one requiring careful handling to avoid damage. From the temple, Pablito led them to even more structures. There was a building with what appeared to be a stone altar or platform, its purpose unclear but its importance evident from the quality of construction. There were fountains, a series of them, fed by a water channel that brought fresh water from a spring somewhere higher up the mountain. The hydraulic engineering was sophisticated, the channels carefully graded to maintain flow without creating erosion, with controls that could regulate water distribution. Each fountain consisted of a stone basin where water collected before overflowing to the next fountain in the sequence. These would have served both practical and ceremonial functions, providing water for daily use while also creating contemplative spaces where the sound and sight of flowing water induced calm. They encountered a carved stone, a single large piece of granite that had been shaped into a complex form with angles and planes cut with precision. The purpose of this stone was mysterious. It might have been an astronomical instrument, used to mark solar events like solstices and equinoxes. It might have been a ritual object, its shape determined by religious beliefs. or it might have served some practical function that wasn't immediately apparent. Without written records, without the ability to question the builders, such objects remained enigmatic, inviting speculation but resisting definitive interpretation. As they explored, moving through narrow passages between buildings, climbing stairs carved from living rock, crossing small plazas where grass now grew thick, Bingham's excitement built steadily. This site was extraordinary. The location alone set it apart, perched on a ridge with dizzying drops on multiple sides, accessible only by trails so difficult that many people would never attempt the journey. But beyond location, there was the quality and scale of construction. The level of planning and execution. The evident importance this place had held. Could this be Vilcabamba? The lost capital of the Neo-Inca state that Bingham had come to Peru to find? It seemed possible. The site was remote enough to have served as a refuge. It was defensible, the approaches limited and easily watched. It had water, agricultural terraces to support a population, ceremonial spaces appropriate for a capital. And yet, doubts crept in even as Bingham allowed himself to hope. Would the Inca have chosen such an inaccessible location for their capital? Wouldn't they have wanted better access to the broader road network to facilitate communication and trade? He pushed these questions aside for the moment. There would be time later for analysis and debate. Right now, the priority was documentation. He needed to see everything, to record as much as possible before they had to descend back to their camp. The photographic plates were limited, so each shot had to be chosen carefully. But he also wanted comprehensive coverage, images that would allow scholars back at Yale to understand what had been found. Pablito continued his tour, seemingly tireless despite the heat and the rough terrain. He showed them more residential buildings, some of which the farmers had cleared and were using for storage. He pointed out what he said was a tower, though vegetation obscured much of its structure. He mentioned that there were more ruins beyond what they could easily reach in a single visit, areas that required machetes to cut through thick growth, or climbs too dangerous without proper equipment. At one point, they encountered a rock face where someone had carved an inscription. The letters were crude but legible, carved into the stone with a sharp tool, possibly a chisel. The inscription read Lizarraga followed by a date, 1902. Bingham questioned the farmers about this. Who was Lizarraga? They explained that Augustin Lizarraga had been a tenant farmer in the region, someone who had explored the ruins several years before Bingham's arrival. He had written his name here, perhaps to establish some claim to the site, or simply out of the timeless human impulse to leave a mark, to say I was here. This revelation complicated matters. Bingham had been hoping to claim discovery of the site, but if Lizarraga had been here in 1902, then clearly Bingham wasn't the first outsider to see these ruins. And of course the local farmers had been here even earlier, since they'd been living on site for years. So what did the discovery even mean in this context? Bingham decided that what mattered wasn't being first but rather being the first to study the site systematically, to bring scientific methods to bear, to place the ruins in their proper historical context. That would be his contribution, the reason this expedition mattered. The sun was climbing toward noon, the heat intensifying. They had been exploring for hours, and Bingham felt exhaustion beginning to compete with excitement. His legs ached from the morning's climb. His notebook was filling with observations. The photographic plates were nearly exhausted. And he needed time to think, to process what he had seen, to begin forming hypotheses about this place. He thanked Pablito profusely for the tour, compensating him with coins that made the boy's eyes widen with delight. He expressed gratitude to the farmers for their hospitality and their willingness to share knowledge of the site. And he told Arteaga that they would need to return, that this was merely an initial reconnaissance and that the real work would require weeks or possibly months of effort. As they began the descent back to the river, Bingham kept looking back, trying to memorize the view, trying to fix this place in his mind. The ruins rose behind them, stone structures emerging from and merging with the living forest, testament to human ambition and skill, to a civilization that had created something remarkable in one of the world's most challenging environments. The morning mist had long since burned away, and the site stood clear in the midday light, dramatic and mysterious, full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The descent required as much care as the ascent, though gravity helped speed their progress. The crude ladders and improvised stairs demanded concentration, especially now that fatigue was becoming a factor. One slip could mean serious injury or worse. But eventually they reached the river, crossed the precarious bridge without incident, and made their way back to camp at Mandaya Pampa. The other expedition members wanted to know immediately what Bingham had found. He tried to describe it, but words felt inadequate. How to convey the scale, the preservation, the drama of the setting? He showed them his notes, but hastily scribbled observations couldn't capture the reality. The photographs, when developed, would help. But even those would be incomplete, unable to communicate the feeling of standing among those ancient stones, of walking paths where Inca priests had walked, of looking out through temple windows at a landscape that had remained essentially unchanged across centuries. That evening, as he sat by the campfire writing a more detailed account in his field journal, Bingham allowed himself to contemplate the magnitude of what had happened. They had set out from Cusco with hopes of finding significant ruins, with dreams of discovering something important. And today, perhaps, those hopes and dreams had been fulfilled. Machu Picchu existed, preserved in remarkable condition, waiting for systematic study. The work ahead would be immense. The site would need to be cleared, measured, mapped, photographed thoroughly, excavated carefully. Artifacts would need to be catalogued. Patterns would need to be identified and interpreted. This would require resources beyond what the current expedition possessed. It would require return trips, larger teams, more funding. But all of that was concern for the future. Right now, in this moment, Bingham simply savored the satisfaction of discovery. He had set out to find the lost cities of the Inca, and while he couldn't yet be certain what Machu Picchu represented in the broader context of Inca civilization, he knew with absolute conviction that it was important. Tomorrow they would continue their expedition, investigating other potential sites, following other leads. But July 24, 1911, would remain vivid in his memory, the day when mist cleared and jungle parted to reveal stones arranged by forgotten hands, a citadel in the clouds, a puzzle demanding to be solved. The fire burned low as night deepened. The river's endless rush provided its constant soundtrack. Stars emerged in the narrow strip of sky visible above the gorge. And somewhere up on that mountain ridge, hidden in darkness, the ruins of Machu Picchu stood as they had stood for centuries, patient as stone, waiting for morning and whatever the future might bring. The air was different in Peru in 1911. Thinner at altitude, yes, but also thick with possibility. Hiram Bingham stood on the cusp of something he couldn't quite name, driven by stories that drifted like smoke through the valleys of the Urubamba River. He was 35 years old, a lecturer in Latin American history at Yale University, and he carried with him an obsession that had been building for years. Not for glory, though that would come. Not for treasure, though the world would later accuse him of that. No, what drove Bingham was simpler and more profound. He wanted to find what had been lost. His fascination with South America had begun years earlier, almost by accident. In 1908, Bingham had attended the first Pan-American Scientific Congress in Santiago, Chile. The formal proceedings interested him, certainly, but it was what happened afterward that changed everything. On his journey home through Peru, a local prefect convinced him to visit the ruins of Choquequiraro, a remote Incan site perched high in the mountains. The trek was punishing. Days of climbing through terrain that seemed determined to defeat human passage. But when Bingham finally stood among those ancient stones, something shifted inside him. The scale of what the Incas had accomplished, the audacity of building such structures in such impossible places, it planted a seed that would grow into an all-consuming quest. Bingham had published an account of that first journey across South America in 1909. The book did reasonably well, but more importantly, it established him as someone willing to endure hardship for historical discovery. Yale University took notice. So did potential sponsors. By 1911, Bingham had assembled support for what he called the Yale Peruvian Expedition. The stated goal was scholarly, to search for Vilcabamba, the lost capital of the Incas, the final refuge where the last independent Inca rulers had resisted Spanish conquest. But beneath that official purpose ran a deeper current. Bingham sensed there were secrets in these mountains that no outsider had yet uncovered. He was right, though not in the way he expected. The legend spoke of cities swallowed by jungle, of temples where gold had once reflected the mountain sun, of fortresses so remote that even the Spanish conquistadors had never found them. Some of these stories were exaggerated, of course, embellished by time and the human tendency to make the past more dramatic than it was. But some were true. The Inca Empire, at its height, had controlled a vast territory stretching along the spine of South America. When the Spanish arrived in the 1530s, that empire fell with stunning speed. Disease, superior weapons, political fragmentation, it all contributed. But not every Inca stronghold surrendered. Some retreated deeper into the mountains, into valleys so remote that Spanish soldiers deemed them not worth the effort to pursue. Vilcabamba was one of these retreats. Historical records suggested it existed somewhere in the cloud forests northwest of Cusco. Manco Inca, after fleeing the Spanish-controlled capital, had established this new center. For decades, it served as a base for continued resistance. Spanish accounts mentioned it, but vaguely, with a kind of imprecision that frustrated historians like Bingham. Where exactly was it? What did it look like? And more intriguing still, were there other sites nearby, places the Spanish had never recorded at all? Bingham spent months in preparation before the 1911 expedition. He studied Spanish colonial documents, searching for clues in century-old texts. He corresponded with Peruvian scholars, men like Carlos Romero, who shared what fragmentary knowledge existed. One document in particular caught his attention. A chronicle written by Antonio de la Calancha, an Augustinian friar, first published in 1631. Calancha's text mentioned Vitcos, described it as being near a great white rock over a spring of fresh water. That detail, specific yet mysterious, became a beacon for Bingham's planning. But preparation in a library differs vastly from action in the field. No amount of reading could fully prepare someone for the reality of traveling through the Peruvian Andes in 1911. This was not tourist-friendly terrain. There were no reliable roads in many areas, no detailed maps, no infrastructure designed for comfortable passage. Travel meant mules, river crossings, negotiations with local farmers who might or might not be helpful. It meant tropical fevers, altitude sickness, insects that bit without mercy, and the constant awareness that help was days away should anything go seriously wrong. Bingham's team consisted of several members, each chosen for specific expertise. There was Harry Foote, a chemistry professor from Yale and Bingham's close friend, who would help with scientific observations. Isaiah Bowman, a geographer, would map the terrain. Kai Hendrickson brought his skills as a naturalist to document the flora and fauna. And several others, including Dr. William Irving, who would serve as the expedition surgeon, a necessity given the hazards they would face. It was a small group, compact enough to move with some efficiency, but large enough to tackle the multiple objectives Bingham had set. They would search for ruins, yes, but also collect geographical data, botanical specimens, archaeological artifacts. The expedition aimed to serve science in multiple ways. Funding had come from Yale University and the National Geographic Society, though the amounts were modest by any standard. Bingham operated on a tight budget, which meant he couldn't hire large numbers of porters or buy the most expensive equipment. This lean operation would force creative solutions and reliance on local knowledge. In retrospect, that constraint proved valuable. A larger, more cumbersome expedition might have attracted unwanted attention or moved too slowly to capitalize on the fleeting opportunities that would arise. The team sailed from New York in June 1911, bound for Melendo on Peru's southern coast. From there, they took a train inland and upward, climbing through desert landscapes that gradually gave way to the greener, more dramatic terrain of the Andes. Cusco, the ancient Inca capital, would serve as their base of operations. Getting their required days of travel, the train threading through gorges and around mountain peaks, the altitude making every breath feel incomplete. Cusco itself was a revelation. Founded by the Incas centuries earlier, it still bore the marks of that sophisticated civilization. Spanish colonial architecture sat atop Inca foundations, creating a visual layering of history. The walls were the most striking feature. Inca masons had cut massive stones to fit together so precisely that no mortar was needed. These walls had survived earthquakes that toppled Spanish buildings constructed on top of them. Walking through Cusco's streets meant walking through time, each block revealing another era, another set of hands shaping stone. Bingham spent time in Cusco gathering information. He spoke with local scholars, with priests who maintained the old churches, with merchants who traveled the rural areas. He asked about ruins, about stories passed down through families, about places in the mountains that locals considered special or sacred. Some people were helpful. Others were skeptical of this foreign professor with his notebooks and his questions. But gradually, Bingham began to piece together a sense of where he might look. The Urubamba Valley kept coming up in conversations. The river that carved through it, locals said, was near several old sites. Perhaps not Vilcabamba itself, but ruins worth investigating. The city of Cusco sits at an elevation of about 3,400 meters, over 11,000 feet above sea level. At that height, the body labors. Simple tasks become tiring. Sleep comes uneasily. Headaches are common, as is nausea. Bingham and his team had to acclimatize, spending days in Cusco before attempting to push deeper into the mountains. During this period, they organized supplies, hired mules, and identified potential guides, local men who knew the trails and spoke Quechua, the language still used by many indigenous communities. One evening in Cusco, Bingham met with a local official who told him about a prospector's comment. This old prospector had mentioned ruins at a place called Machu Picchu, Old Peak in Quechua. The prospector hadn't been particularly interested in archaeology, so his description was vague, but he'd said the ruins were extensive, more than just a few scattered stones. The official, however, had given this information no particular importance. Ruins were common in the region. The Incas had built everywhere. But Bingham noted it down, adding Machu Picchu to his mental list of possible destinations. By late July, preparations were complete. The team was ready to leave Cusco and follow the Urubamba River northwest, deeper into the mountains. The plan was to travel on foot and by mule, stopping at any promising sites along the way. They would camp in whatever shelters they could find or construct, relying on supplies they carried and whatever food they could purchase from local farmers. It would be slow, difficult work, but Bingham felt a growing excitement. Historical documents suggested this area held secrets. Local stories reinforced that sense. All he had to do was look carefully enough. The Yale Peruvian expedition of 1911 was not the first group to search for Inca ruins, and Bingham knew it. The Spanish had explored these regions centuries earlier, though their interest had been primarily in conquest and conversion, not archaeology. More recently, other travelers had passed through. But most of these earlier explorers had followed established routes or had specific economic interests. Bingham's approach was different. He intended to be systematic, to investigate multiple sites, to document everything carefully. He wanted not just to find ruins, but to understand them, to place them within the broader narrative of Inca history. Part of what made Bingham's quest difficult was the jungle itself. The eastern slopes of the Andes descend into the Amazon basin, creating a transition zone where mountain ecosystems meet rainforest. This region receives heavy rainfall, particularly during certain seasons. Vegetation grows with aggressive speed. Vines strangle trees. Moss covers stones. Within decades, a structure can be completely hidden beneath green growth. The Incas had abandoned many of their mountain settlements when the Spanish conquest disrupted their society. Those centuries of abandonment meant nature had reclaimed much of what human hands had built. Finding ruins, then, required more than just hiking through the mountains. It required looking for subtle clues. An unusual arrangement of stones. A terrace edge barely visible beneath vegetation. A change in the plant species that might indicate disturbed soil. Bingham had studied enough to recognize these signs, but he also relied heavily on local knowledge. Farmers knew their land. They noticed things. And some of them remembered stories their grandparents had told, stories about the old ones who had lived there before. The morning of July 19, 1911, the expedition finally departed Cusco. They traveled down the Urubamba Valley, a spectacular gorge where the river had carved through layers of ancient rock. The trail was narrow in places, barely wide enough for a mule to pass safely. On one side, the mountain rose nearly vertical. On the other, it dropped away to the river far below. Every step required attention. The mules, wiser than their riders about such terrain, moved with careful deliberation. At night, they camped wherever they found suitable ground. Sometimes this meant a clearing by the river. Other times, they stayed in small settlements where farmers allowed them to sleep in storage buildings or corrals. The hospitality varied. Some locals were welcoming, curious about these foreigners and their strange mission. Others were wary, keeping their distance. Bingham respected this wariness. These communities had reasons to distrust outsiders. Centuries of colonial exploitation had taught hard lessons. Progress was slow, but Bingham didn't mind. Each day brought new observations, new conversations, new possibilities. He asked everyone he met about ruins. Most people knew of something, a wall here, a terrace there. The team investigated several sites during those initial days. Some were minor, little more than a few foundation stones. Others were more substantial, suggesting settlements or fortifications. Bingham documented each one, taking photographs, making sketches, recording precise locations. Nothing he found during those first days was the lost capital he sought, but each site added a piece to the puzzle of how the Incas had organized this region. The Urubamba River itself was magnificent. Fed by snowmelt from high peaks, it ran cold and fast. During the rainy season, it could swell to frightening proportions, washing away bridges and making crossings impossible. Even in the dry season, it commanded respect. The sound of it was constant, a deep rushing that formed the soundtrack to their journey. At night, lying in his sleeping roll, Bingham could hear that water moving, always moving, carrying the story of these mountains down toward the Amazon. By July 23, the expedition had reached a point where the valley narrowed considerably. The mountains pressed in close on both sides, their slopes thick with vegetation. The river here moved with particular violence, crashing over boulders and creating rapids that would be suicidal to navigate. There was a sense of remoteness, as if they had passed beyond the edge of the known world and entered a realm where different rules applied. That afternoon, they stopped at a place called Mandaya Pampa, a small clearing where a few farmers maintained fields. The site offered level ground for camping and access to fresh water from a tributary stream. Bingham spoke with the farmers through his interpreter, asking the now familiar questions about ruins. One farmer, a man named Melchor Artiega, responded with interest. Yes, he knew of ruins. There were some on top of the mountain, the one called Pichu. And there were others on a ridge nearby, at Machu Picchu. The ruins at Machu Picchu were substantial, he said, with many terraces and buildings. This wasn't the first time Bingham had heard mention of Machu Picchu, but Artiega's description was more detailed than the earlier vague references. The farmer offered to guide them the next day if they were interested. The climb would be difficult, he warned. The trail was steep and overgrown in sections. But if they started early and moved steadily, they could reach the ruins and return before dark. Bingham agreed immediately. He paid Artiega in advance, ensuring the farmer's commitment. This might be just another minor site, but it warranted investigation. Every lead had to be followed. That was how you found what had been lost. That night, Bingham lay awake longer than usual, listening to the river, feeling the cool mountain air on his face. Something felt different about tomorrow. He couldn't articulate exactly what, just a sense of anticipation that went beyond mere curiosity. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. In exploration, you never knew until you looked. Morning came with the kind of grey light that characterizes high-altitude dawns. The sun hadn't yet cleared the surrounding peaks, so the valley remained in shadow, cool and quiet. Bingham rose early, noting that it was July 24, 1911. He ate a simple breakfast, checked his equipment, made sure his camera was ready. Not everyone in the expedition would make this climb. Some needed to stay with the main camp, attending to scientific work there. But Sergeant Carrasco, a Peruvian government guard assigned to the expedition for security, would accompany Bingham and Artiega. The three men set out while the morning was still young. They walked along the valley floor briefly before Artiega led them to what passed for a bridge over the Urubamba River. Bridge was perhaps too generous a term. It consisted of several logs lashed together with vines, spanning the river at one of its narrower points. The structure looked alarmingly fragile, swaying under even the slightest weight. Below, the river churned white over rocks. One slip would be fatal. Bingham crossed carefully, trying not to think about the physics involved, trying not to imagine the logs breaking free and tumbling into that cold, violent water. He made it across. So did Carrasco. Artiega, who had crossed this bridge many times, moved with the confident ease of someone for whom such crossings were routine. On the far side of the river, the real climb began. The trail, such as it was, switchbacked up the mountainside. Sometimes it was clearly defined, worn by foot traffic over years. Other times it disappeared entirely into vegetation, and Artiega had to push forward through growth that threatened to block passage completely. The angle was relentless. For every step forward, it seemed they gained half a step in altitude. Bingham's lungs worked hard. At this elevation, around 2,000 meters above sea level and climbing higher, the air held less oxygen. Every breath felt insufficient. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the morning coolness. The forest around them was dense and alive with sound. Birds called from hidden perches. Insects hummed. Something larger, perhaps a deer or a viscacha, crashed through underbrush and was gone before Bingham could glimpse it. The vegetation itself was a study in variety. Massive trees draped with vines and moss. Ferns taller than a person. orchids clinging to branches, their delicate flowers incongruous in this wild setting. The Inca had built in this? Bingham marveled at the determination that must have required, the sheer human stubbornness to look at this jungle-covered mountain and say, "Here, we will build something that lasts." They climbed for nearly 2 hours. Bingham's legs burned. His breath came in gasps. The trail offered no mercy, just continued upward, always upward. Occasionally, Arteaga would pause, ostensibly to let them rest, but Bingham suspected it was more to give them a chance to appreciate their surroundings. The view, when they stopped and turned to look back, was breathtaking. The Urubamba Valley spread below them, the river a silver ribbon winding through green. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks disappearing into clouds. This was a landscape on a scale that humbled human ambition. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of climbing, the trail began to level out somewhat. They had reached a ridge, a long spine of mountain that ran roughly east to west. The vegetation here was less oppressive, though still substantial. And then, as they followed Arteaga around a curve in the trail, Bingham saw the first sign that people had lived here. A terrace. Not a natural formation, but clearly constructed. A stone retaining wall held back earth, creating a level planting surface. The wall itself was impressive, stones fitted together with precision. This was Inca work. No doubt about it. Arteaga led them further, and more terraces appeared. Many more. They covered the slope like steps for giants, each level carefully engineered to prevent erosion and maximize planting area. Some were overgrown, their retaining walls barely visible beneath vegetation. Others were relatively clear, being used by farmers who had rediscovered these ancient agricultural spaces. Bingham's heart began to race with more than just exertion. This was significant. The number of terraces suggested a substantial settlement. You didn't build this much agricultural infrastructure for a small outpost. Then Arteaga pointed ahead. Through a gap in the trees, Bingham caught sight of a building. Just a glimpse at first, grey stone walls emerging from green. But as they continued walking, more buildings appeared. Many more. They had arrived at Machu Picchu, though Bingham didn't yet know the full scale of what he was seeing. The jungle still concealed much. But even that first partial view was enough to stop him in his tracks. This was not a minor sight. This was something extraordinary. Near the terraces, Arteaga called out. 2 men appeared from one of the buildings. Arteaga introduced them as Richard and Alvarez, local farmers who had been living on the site with their families for the past 4 years. They had cleared some of the terraces for planting and used one of the better preserved buildings as shelter. The farmers greeted Bingham and Carrasco with a mixture of curiosity and friendliness. They seemed pleased to have visitors, perhaps lonely in this remote location. Richard's 11-year-old son, Pablito, was particularly excited by the newcomers. When Arteaga explained that the foreigners wanted to see all the ruins, Pablito volunteered to lead them. He knew the site well, having explored it thoroughly in the way curious children do. Bingham gladly accepted the boy's offer, and Pablito set off with the enthusiasm of youth, leading them deeper into the ruins. What Bingham saw in those first minutes was almost impossible to process. Buildings emerged from the jungle like revelation itself. Massive walls of perfectly fitted stone. Doorways framed by lintel blocks weighing tons. Terraces stacked one above another, climbing toward the peak of the mountain. Staircases carved from single pieces of rock. Water channels cut with geometric precision. This was not a random collection of structures. This was a city, planned and executed with sophistication that rivaled anything the Spanish had built, anything Bingham had seen anywhere. The buildings were arranged in sectors that suggested different purposes. Some areas seemed residential, with smaller structures clustered together. Others had the feel of ceremonial space, with larger buildings and open plazas. Many structures had roof beams missing, the thatch or whatever had covered them long gone. But the stone walls remained, standing square and true despite centuries of neglect, despite the jungle's best efforts to pull them down. The stonework itself was mesmerizing. Bingham was not an archaeologist by training, he was a historian, but he knew enough to recognize mastery when he saw it. The Inca had not used mortar. Instead, they had shaped each stone to fit its neighbor so precisely that blade of grass couldn't slip between them. Some stones had multiple faces and angles, like three-dimensional puzzles solved in granite. How had they achieved this? Without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals larger than llamas, how had they cut stone with such precision? How had they lifted blocks that weighed tons into place high on this mountain? The questions overwhelmed him. Pablito led them through a complex of buildings arranged around what appeared to be a central plaza. The grass grew thick here, but the outline of the open space was clear. Buildings lined three sides, each one substantial enough to suggest importance. This had been a gathering place, surely, somewhere people assembled for ceremonies or governance or both. Bingham walked across the plaza, feeling the weight of history beneath his feet. How many people had crossed this same ground 500 years ago? What conversations had echoed here? What decisions had been made? On the far side of the plaza, Pablito pointed up. Following the boy's gesture, Bingham saw a series of structures climbing the hillside toward a higher peak. The trail upward was steep but navigable, and the buildings at the top seemed particularly well constructed. Bingham decided he needed to see those as well. The climb was demanding after the already exhausting morning, but curiosity drove him forward. Carrasco and Pablito followed as Bingham picked his way up stone stairs that had survived half a millennium. At the top, breathing hard, Bingham found himself in what could only be described as a sacred precinct. The buildings here were different, their construction even more refined. One structure had three massive windows facing east, toward the mountains where the sun would rise. The stonework was flawless, each block shaped and positioned with a care that suggested religious or ceremonial purpose. This was not a storehouse or a residence. This was a temple, or something like it, a place where the material and spiritual worlds intersected. Bingham stood in that temple with the three windows, looking out at the mountains, and felt something shift in his understanding. This site, Machu Picchu, was not just another Inca settlement. It was something special. The location, the craftsmanship, the scale of what had been built, all pointed to exceptional importance. Was this Vilcabamba the lost capital he sought? He wasn't certain. But even if it wasn't, he had found something remarkable. Something that would force scholars to reconsider what they knew about the Inca Empire. The rest of that morning passed in a haze of discovery. Bingham moved from building to building, taking photographs when the light allowed, making notes in his journal, trying to capture details that might prove important later. The site was vast. Much larger than he'd initially realized. Buildings and terraces extended in all directions, some still buried under vegetation. Fully excavating and documenting this place would require months, perhaps years, and resources far beyond what his current expedition could marshal. But he could begin the work. He could establish that this place existed and deserved serious archaeological attention. The farmers, Richard and Alvarez, watched Bingham's excitement with amused patience. For them, these ruins were simply a place to live and farm. They saw the stones every day. They used the terraces for planting. The buildings sheltered their families. The magic that Bingham felt, the sense of touching something profound, that was a luxury of outsiders who could afford to marvel. For the locals, this was just home, impressive perhaps, but familiar. Still, they answered Bingham's questions as best they could, though they knew little of the site's history. Their families had only been there a few years. Before that, the jungle had held the ruins in quiet embrace for centuries. One thing the farmers could tell him was that others had visited. Occasionally, travelers would make the climb, drawn by rumors or curiosity. Some came looking for treasure, though the farmers said there was none to find. The Inca hadn't left gold here, or if they had, it was long gone. More recently, perhaps a decade earlier, someone had visited and left his name carved on a wall. Bingham wanted to see this inscription, and Richard led him to the Temple of the Three Windows. There, scratched into the stone of one of those magnificent eastern-facing openings, Bingham read, Lizarraga 1902. The name meant nothing to Bingham at the time. He noted it in his journal, recognizing that this meant he was not the first outsider to reach Machu Picchu, but not fully appreciating what that discovery would later mean. In the moment, his attention was drawn back to the temple itself, to the way morning light would stream through those three windows, to the astronomical alignments that seemed deliberately incorporated into the design. Later, he would learn that Agustin Lizarraga had been a local explorer who had indeed visited the ruins 9 years earlier, leading a small group up the mountain. But Lizarraga had never published his findings, never brought the site to wider attention. In the curious calculus of discovery, that lack of publication would mean Bingham received credit for revealing Machu Picchu to the world, even though he clearly wasn't the first to arrive. As midday approached, Bingham realized he couldn't possibly document everything in a single visit. There was too much to see, too many questions to ask, too many photographs to take. He would need to return, and return well-equipped for serious archaeological work. But for this first reconnaissance, he had accomplished the essential tasks, confirming the site existed, assessing its scale and significance, and gathering initial documentation. The afternoon would be spent in more detailed note-taking and photography before the descent back to camp. The light at midday was harsh for photography, but Bingham worked with what he had, capturing images of the most impressive structures. His camera was a large format affair, requiring careful setup and adjustment for each shot. Each photograph consumed time and attention, but Bingham knew these images would be crucial. Back in New Haven, back in the academic world, skeptics would demand evidence. The photographs would provide that, showing these magnificent structures perched on their impossible mountain ridge. Sergeant Carrasco, meanwhile, had been exploring on his own. He returned to tell Bingham about additional structures he'd found in another sector of the ruins. There were dozens of buildings, perhaps more than 100, spread across the ridge and up the surrounding slopes. Some appeared to be residences, with multiple rooms and doorways connecting them. Others were clearly specialized, their unique construction suggesting specific purposes that would require study to understand. The overall impression was of a carefully planned community, not a haphazard collection of buildings, but a city designed with intention and purpose. During a rest period, sitting on a terrace wall with the valley spread below him, Bingham tried to imagine what this place had been. Who had lived here? When had it been built? Why this particular location, so remote and difficult to access? The Spanish conquistadors had written extensively about the Incas, but none of their chronicles mentioned a citadel at this location. That suggested Machu Picchu had been abandoned before the Spanish arrived, or had been so secret that news of it never reached European ears. Either possibility raised intriguing questions. The Inca Empire had reached its greatest extent in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, just before Spanish contact. At that peak, it controlled territory stretching from modern Colombia down through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and into Chile and Argentina. The empire's achievements were staggering: a road system spanning thousands of miles, agricultural techniques that fed millions, architectural marvels that still stand today, and a system of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipus. All this accomplished without a written language, without the wheel, without iron tools. The more Bingham learned about the Inca, the more he marveled at what they had achieved. But the empire had also been fragile. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532, he found the Inca state weakened by civil war and susceptible to the diseases Europeans unknowingly brought. Within decades, the Inca Empire had collapsed, its population decimated, its structures repurposed or abandoned, its history preserved imperfectly in Spanish accounts that often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented what they documented. Sites like Machu Picchu, then, were precious artifacts of that lost civilization, physical evidence that could speak when written records were absent or unreliable. Bingham spent hours that afternoon measuring and sketching. His training as a historian had taught him to be methodical, to record observations systematically. Every building got a notation. Every unusual feature was documented. He sketched rough maps showing how structures related to each other spatially. The work was painstaking and would have been tedious if not for the constant awareness that he was documenting something few outsiders had ever seen. The vegetation made observation difficult. Vines had grown over walls. Moss obscured carved details. Trees had taken root in plazas, their roots working slowly but inexorably to destabilize foundations. In some areas, buildings had partially collapsed, their stones scattered down the hillside. Bingham realized that if he wanted to truly understand Machu Picchu, extensive clearing and excavation would be necessary. The jungle was slowly reclaiming what the Inca had built, and that process of decay would only accelerate if left unchecked. As afternoon slipped toward evening, Bingham knew he needed to begin the descent. The return journey would be faster than the morning climb, gravity being on their side, but it would still take hours. And attempting to navigate that bridge over the Urubamba in darkness would be unwise at best, suicidal at worst. Reluctantly, he gathered his equipment, thanked Richard and Alvarez for their hospitality, and followed Pablito back toward the trail down. The descent was indeed faster, though no less demanding on the legs. Going downhill on such steep terrain requires constant bracing, constant control. One slip could mean a dangerous tumble. But Bingham barely noticed the physical strain. His mind was racing with what he'd seen, with the implications and possibilities. This discovery, he sensed, would define his career. It might even redefine how the world understood the Inca civilization. Back at Mandaya Pampa, the rest of the expedition was eager for news. Bingham described what he'd found, though he knew his words couldn't fully capture the reality. You had to see Machu Picchu to understand it. The photographs would help, once developed. But even those would only hint at the scale and beauty of what lay on that mountain ridge. He promised his team they would return, better equipped, ready for serious work. This was not an endpoint but a beginning. That night, Bingham lay in his tent, exhausted but unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to those terraces, those precisely fitted stones, those temples and plazas. He thought about the inscription, Lizarraga 1902, and wondered how many others might have visited over the centuries. Had the Spanish truly never known about this place? Or had they known and chosen not to record it? Were there other sites like this, hidden in the mountains, waiting for someone to look? The questions multiplied, and sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of stone cities and jungle-wrapped peaks. July 24, 1911, would become one of the most famous dates in archaeological history, though Bingham couldn't know that yet. He had walked into Machu Picchu as a curious scholar following local rumors. He had walked out as the man who would introduce this wonder to the world. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The ruins he had glimpsed that day still held countless secrets, mysteries that would take decades to unravel. And the controversy over his discovery, over what it meant and who deserved credit, that too lay ahead, waiting in time's patient embrace. For now, though, on this July night in 1911, Hiram Bingham simply rested, letting the sound of the Urubamba River lull him toward sleep, knowing that when morning came, he would need to decide what came next. Behind him, on its mountain ridge, Machu Picchu waited in darkness, as it had waited for centuries, its stones holding stories that the world was finally ready to hear again. Sleep comes easier in some places than others. Tonight, perhaps you found yourself thinking about mysteries that remain unsolved, about discoveries that raise more questions than they answer. We left Hiram Bingham by a campfire in the Urubamba Gorge, his mind racing with possibilities after his first glimpse of Machu Picchu. Now we return with him, weeks later, when the full scope of his find would begin to reveal itself. The initial visit to Machu Picchu on July 24 had been brief, a reconnaissance that lasted only a few hours. Bingham and his small party had seen enough to know the site was significant, but hardly enough to understand it. The expedition continued its journey along the Urubamba, investigating other potential sites, following leads that proved both fruitful and frustrating. They documented ruins at several locations, each adding to the growing picture of how extensively the Inca had developed this region. But Bingham's thoughts kept returning to that ridgetop citadel, to those precisely fitted stones emerging from jungle growth. By early August, logistical considerations forced decisions about how to allocate remaining time and resources. The expedition couldn't stay in Peru indefinitely. Funding had limits, as did the patience of academic administrators back at Yale who expected results. Bingham decided to divide his efforts. Some team members would continue exploring new sites, casting a wide net in hopes of finding additional significant ruins. But Bingham himself would return to Machu Picchu with a small crew, dedicating the time needed to conduct at least a preliminary study of the site. This decision wasn't without controversy within the expedition. Some team members felt they should continue searching for Vilcabamba, the lost Inca capital that remained their official objective. Others worried that focusing too much attention on a single site, no matter how impressive, would limit their broader findings. But Bingham's enthusiasm was infectious, and ultimately his vision prevailed. They would give Machu Picchu the attention it demanded. The return journey to Mandaya Pampa took several days, retracing routes they had already traveled. The scenery remained spectacular, but familiarity dulled some of its impact. What had seemed exotic and foreign weeks earlier now felt almost routine. The mind adapts quickly to changed circumstances, and the Urubamba Gorge, as dramatic as it was, had become their workplace, their temporary home. The expedition members had adapted to altitude, to local food, to the constant challenges of working in difficult terrain. Bingham brought more people and more equipment this second time. He recruited workers from nearby communities, men who could clear vegetation, men who could assist with excavation, men who could haul supplies up the steep trail to the ruins. He brought additional photographic supplies, more notebooks, surveying equipment that would allow him to create accurate maps. And he brought time, or at least as much time as circumstances would permit. They would spend weeks at the site if necessary, camping there if feasible or making repeated day trips if camping proved impractical. The ascent from the river was no less strenuous on repetition. The trail remained treacherous, the bridge across the Urubamba remained an exercise in controlled fear, the improvised stairs and ladders remained tests of endurance and nerve. But Bingham climbed with purpose now, driven by specific questions he wanted to answer, specific features he wanted to document. The mystery of Machu Picchu had taken hold of his imagination, and he approached the ruins with the focused intensity of someone pursuing answers. When they reached the site, the work began immediately. The first priority was clearing vegetation. The jungle had been reclaiming Machu Picchu for centuries, and while this growth had helped preserve the site by making it less accessible to casual looters, it now obscured the very features Bingham most wanted to study. Workers wielded machetes, cutting back the aggressive vegetation, revealing walls and doorways, exposing plazas and terraces. The labor was hot, exhausting work, sweat-drenched and punctuated by discoveries of new structures hidden beneath the green tangle. As the vegetation fell away, the site's true scale became apparent. This was larger than Bingham had initially realized, more complex in its layout. There were distinct sectors, each with characteristic features. The agricultural zone consisted of terraces, hundreds of them, carved into the mountainside with impressive engineering. The urban sector contained the residences, temples, and other structures. And there were features whose purpose remained unclear, anomalies that didn't fit neatly into categories derived from Spanish chronicles or from other Inca sites. Bingham divided the work systematically. Some workers focused on clearing vegetation. Others began the careful process of documenting what was revealed. The photographer, working with glass plates that required precise timing and careful chemical processing, captured images methodically. Wide shots showed context, the relationship between structures and landscape. Medium shots revealed architectural details, the quality of stonework, the arrangement of buildings. Close-ups focused on specific features, carved stones, doorways, windows, anything that might prove significant when studied later. Harry Foote conducted surveys, using traditional tools to measure distances and angles, creating a map that would allow scholars to understand the site's layout. This was painstaking work, made more challenging by the terrain. Machu Picchu occupied a mountain ridge with significant elevation changes across short distances. What appeared to be adjacent structures might actually differ in height by many meters. Accurate mapping required accounting for these vertical variations while also capturing the horizontal relationships between features. Isaiah Bowman, the geographer, studied the broader context. How did this site relate to its surrounding landscape? Why had the Inca chosen this particular location? The answers weren't immediately obvious. The position was dramatic but inconvenient, requiring difficult access along trails that would have challenged even the sure-footed llamas the Inca used for transport. Yet clearly, substantial resources had been invested here. Thousands of people must have labored to build these structures, these terraces, these water systems. That investment implied purpose, implied that Machu Picchu served some function important enough to justify the enormous effort required to construct and maintain it. The team established routines as the days progressed. Each morning they would climb from their camp near the river, hauling supplies and equipment. The ascent became familiar, though never easy. Muscles learned the rhythm, feet found reliable footholds, but the physical demands remained substantial. Upon reaching the site, work would begin immediately, racing against the afternoon rains that came with clockwork regularity in this climate. The rains would drive them into whatever shelter they could find, usually under overhanging rocks or in partially intact structures. Then, when the deluge passed, they would resume work, often continuing until failing light made further progress impossible. Evenings were spent organizing the day's findings. Bingham would review photographs with the photographer, planning which areas needed additional coverage. He would compare survey measurements with his rough sketches, correcting errors, adding details. He would write extensive entries in his field journal, recording observations while they remained fresh in memory, capturing nuances that might otherwise be forgotten. These evening sessions often extended late into the night, lamplight illuminating notebooks as exhausted men pushed themselves to complete necessary documentation. The local farmers, Richard and Alvarez, and their families, proved invaluable as informants. They had lived on the site for years, had explored areas that Bingham's team hadn't yet reached, knew details about seasonal weather patterns and how they affected access to different sections. The farmers spoke Quechua primarily, with some Spanish, requiring translation through Sergeant Carrasco or other bilingual expedition members. Despite language barriers, useful information was exchanged. The farmers described caves they had found, buildings they had seen in areas thick with vegetation, water sources that might prove useful for establishing a more permanent camp. Young Pablito continued serving as an enthusiastic guide, his energy seemingly inexhaustible despite the challenging conditions. He would lead expedition members to features they hadn't yet documented, scrambling over difficult terrain with the agility of youth and the confidence of someone completely familiar with the environment. His knowledge proved particularly valuable when identifying safe routes through areas where the ancient pathways had collapsed or been swallowed by vegetation. On more than one occasion, his warnings prevented expedition members from taking dangerous paths that might have led to serious falls. As clearing progressed and more of the site became visible, patterns emerged. The architecture wasn't uniform. Different areas featured different construction styles, different qualities of stonework. This variation told a story about the site's organization, about who had lived where, about hierarchies of importance and status. The finest stonework appeared in what Bingham began calling the Sacred District, the area around the Temple of the Three Windows and nearby structures. Here, stones were cut with incredible precision, surfaces polished smooth, corners meeting at exact angles. The blocks were large, many weighing several tons, yet they fit together so perfectly that even centuries of weathering hadn't opened significant gaps between them. This level of craftsmanship required exceptional skill, tools capable of shaping granite, an understanding of how to transport and position enormous weights, and most importantly, time. Creating such walls couldn't be rushed. Each block needed individual attention, needed shaping to match its neighbors exactly. Bingham spent hours examining these walls, running his hands over the smooth surfaces, trying to understand how such precision had been achieved. The Inca hadn't possessed iron tools, working instead with bronze implements and stone hammers. Bronze is softer than granite, seemingly inadequate for cutting and shaping such hard stone. Yet somehow the Inca masons had managed it. Perhaps they used abrasives, sand, or crushed stone mixed with water, wearing away granite through patient repetition. Perhaps they exploited natural weaknesses in the stone, freeze-thaw cycles or natural fracture lines that allowed them to split and shape blocks more easily than pure cutting would require. The exact techniques remained mysterious, knowledge that had died with the craftsmen who possessed it. In contrast, residential areas featured simpler construction. Stones were still fitted together competently, but with less precision, with rougher surfaces, with occasional use of mortar to fill gaps. This made perfect sense from a practical standpoint. Royal buildings or temples deserved the finest work, reflecting their importance in the social and religious hierarchy. Ordinary dwellings, while still solid and functional, didn't require the same level of craftsmanship. The differential investment of skill and labor communicated status, made hierarchy visible and tangible. Bingham attempted to document these different construction styles photographically, but the limitations of the medium frustrated him. Black and white images struggled to capture subtle variations in stonework quality. The texture of surfaces, the precision of joints, the differences in finishing, these were best appreciated in person, through direct observation and touch. Still, he did what he could, carefully composing shots that showed representative examples of different styles, hoping that viewers back home might discern at least some of the variation he was witnessing. The trapezoidal doorways received particular attention. This distinctive Inca architectural feature appeared throughout the site, in buildings both grand and modest. The shape wasn't arbitrary but reflected sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics. The inward-leaning walls distributed weight more effectively than vertical walls would, creating inherent stability. In an earthquake-prone region, this was critical. Spanish colonial buildings in Cusco had collapsed during seismic events while Inca foundations remained intact, testament to the superior engineering of the earlier civilization. But doorways also revealed social information. Size varied considerably. Some doorways were barely adequate for a person to pass through, requiring stooping or turning sideways. Others were more generous, allowing comfortable passage. The largest doorways appeared in the most important buildings, suggesting they were designed to accommodate groups entering or exiting together, or perhaps to communicate the status of the building itself. A larger doorway suggested importance, suggested that significant activities occurred within, suggested that people of high status passed through. Interior spaces showed similar variation. Most buildings consisted of single rooms with relatively small floor areas, perhaps 5 meters by 4 meters, sometimes even smaller. But some structures featured larger spaces or multiple rooms interconnected by interior doorways. These more complex buildings clustered in certain areas, suggesting neighborhood patterns, areas where related families or social groups had lived in proximity. Bingham tried to map these patterns, to identify whether the site's layout reflected social organization, but the evidence was ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. Water management revealed additional sophistication. The site's water system consisted of a main channel that captured flow from a spring located approximately half a kilometer from the ruins. This channel, carefully engineered with the gradient necessary to maintain flow without creating erosion, delivered water to a series of 16 ritual fountains distributed throughout the urban sector. Each fountain featured a basin where water collected before overflowing into a channel that carried it to the next fountain in the sequence. The system demonstrated detailed planning and skilled execution. Water pressure needed to be maintained. The channels needed to be watertight. The fountains needed to be positioned to serve the population while also fitting into the site's ceremonial geography. The hydraulic engineering impressed Bingham profoundly. In a modern city, water systems are planned by specialists with sophisticated knowledge of fluid dynamics, of materials science, of construction techniques. The Inca achieved comparable results without the benefit of written mathematical notation, without metal tools capable of precise measurements, without wheels or pulleys or cranes. They worked with stone, wood, and bronze, with human and animal muscle power, with accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of builders. The results spoke to the power of empirical observation and trial and error. If a design worked, you repeated it. If it failed, you modified and tried again. Over centuries, this iterative process produced genuine expertise. Bingham had the water system photographed extensively, understanding that these images would help convey Inca engineering sophistication to audiences who might otherwise dismiss indigenous American civilizations as primitive. The fountains were particularly photogenic, water still flowing through channels carved centuries ago, demonstrating that the system remained functional despite long abandonment. These images would become some of the most frequently published photographs from the expedition, helping establish Machu Picchu's reputation as an engineering marvel. The terraces posed their own engineering challenges and rewards. Building on steep slopes required creating flat surfaces where none naturally existed. This meant either cutting into the hillside or building up with fill, and typically both. A retaining wall would be constructed, strong enough to hold back tons of earth. Behind this wall, fill material would be added, a careful mix of rocks, gravel, sand, and topsoil, lead to provide drainage and prevent waterlogging. The surface would be leveled and planted. Over time, with proper maintenance, such terraces could remain productive for generations. But these terraces served purposes beyond agriculture. They also protected the site from erosion and landslides, constant threats in steep terrain with significant rainfall. The terraces functioned as a stabilization system, their retaining walls absorbing runoff energy, their drainage systems channeling excess water safely away. Without these engineered slopes, the entire site would have been vulnerable to collapse, particularly during the intense rains that came seasonally. The terraces weren't merely practical additions but essential components of the site's viability. Bingham attempted to calculate the agricultural capacity of the terraces. How much food could be produced? Could the terraces have supported the site's population, or would additional supplies have needed to be imported from elsewhere? The calculations were difficult, requiring estimates of ancient crop yields, assumptions about what crops had been grown, guesses about how many people had lived at the site. His conclusions were tentative at best, more educated speculation than rigorous analysis. But the exercise helped him think about Machu Picchu as a functioning community rather than merely an archaeological site. People had lived here. They had needed food, water, shelter. Understanding how those needs were met was crucial for understanding what this place had been. The presence of agricultural terraces so close to ceremonial structures struck Bingham as unusual. In many societies, sacred spaces were kept separate from mundane agricultural activities. But the Inca apparently saw no such conflict. Agriculture was itself sacred, tied to cosmological beliefs about fertility, about the relationships between humans, land, and divine forces. The earth was Pachamama, Mother Earth, a deity requiring offerings and respect. Working the land was thus both practical necessity and religious act. The proximity of terraces to temples made perfect sense within this worldview, even if it seemed strange to observers from cultures with different conceptions of sacred and profane space. As clearing continued, certain structures emerged as obviously special, marked by superior construction and strategic positioning. The Temple of the Three Windows remained one of the most impressive, its massive trapezoidal openings looking out toward the east, toward the rising sun. Bingham spent considerable time here, studying the stonework, contemplating the view, trying to imagine the ceremonies that might have been performed in this space. The temple sat on the eastern side of what appeared to be a main plaza, a ceremonial center for the entire complex. The plaza had been leveled with tremendous effort, creating a flat open space where the community could gather. Stone steps connected different elevation levels within the plaza, allowing movement between areas while maintaining the overall geometric order. The plaza's positioning seemed deliberate, chosen to maximize dramatic views while also providing access to major structures. Adjacent to the Temple of the Three Windows stood another significant building, nearly as impressive in its construction. This structure featured a large single room with multiple niches carved into the walls, small alcoves that might have held ceremonial objects, offerings, or simply items of practical use. The stonework was exceptional, blocks fitted with the same precision evident in the temple. Bingham designated this the principal temple, believing it had served important religious functions. Whether his interpretation was correct would be debated by later scholars, but certainly the building's construction quality indicated it had been important. Behind the principal temple, accessed by a small doorway, was another chamber sometimes called the sacristy, a room that might have been used for ritual preparation or storage of ceremonial objects. The walls here bore unusual features, small carved stones that protruded like hooks or pegs. Their purpose was unclear, but they suggested some specific function, some need that had been met by these permanent fixtures. Moving through the site, Bingham identified what he believed was a royal residence sector. These buildings featured better construction than average residences but weren't quite at the level of the temples. They occupied choice locations with excellent views and convenient access to water. Interior spaces were larger than in ordinary houses. There were more niches, more architectural details, more evidence of careful planning. If Machu Picchu had indeed been a royal estate, these would have been the buildings where nobility resided, where administrators conducted their work, where the elite class that organized and directed the community maintained their living quarters. One building in this sector particularly intrigued Bingham. It featured a distinctive curved wall, a rarity in Inca architecture which typically favored straight lines and right angles. This curved wall was built to exceptional standards, each stone carefully shaped to maintain the flowing line while preserving structural integrity. The building was positioned to take advantage of morning sun, its entrance facing east. Interior investigation revealed evidence of careful finishing, smooth plaster that had once covered the stone walls, remnants of which still clung to protected corners. This building came to be called the Temple of the Sun, and adjacent to it, beneath it actually, was a natural cave that had been carefully modified. The cave's walls had been finished with precisely fitted stonework, transforming a natural feature into an architectural space. This cave became known as the Royal Tomb, though whether it had actually been used for burials remained unclear. Bingham found it empty except for scattered pottery fragments and some human bone that might have been deposited there at any time. Still, the careful finishing of the space suggested it had held importance, had been intended for some significant purpose. The Intihuatana stone stood on a high point, a location that required climbing steep stairs carved from living rock. This carved stone outcrop had been shaped with remarkable precision, its surfaces cut at specific angles, its central pillar rising vertically from a sculpted base. The name Intihuatana, meaning hitching post of the sun, came from Quechua speakers, though whether this reflected the stone's original purpose or represented later interpretation was unclear. Bingham studied the Intihuatana obsessively, convinced it held astronomical significance. He took measurements, noted alignments, observed how shadows fell at different times of day. The stone's geometry was complex, with multiple faces and angles that suggested it might have been used to track solar movement throughout the year. The Inca had been careful astronomical observers, had developed calendars tied to agricultural cycles, had celebrated solstices and equinoxes with important ceremonies. An instrument that allowed precise solar observations would have been valuable, perhaps essential. But proving astronomical function was difficult. Such proof required observing the stone over a complete annual cycle, recording exactly how shadows fell on solstices, equinoxes, and other significant dates. Bingham lacked the time for such patient observation. He took what measurements he could, photographed the stone from multiple angles, and noted features that suggested astronomical use. But definitive conclusions would have to wait for later researchers with more time and specialized expertise. The position of the Intihuatana itself was significant. It stood at a high point visible from many areas of the site, a landmark that would have drawn the eye. Standing beside it, one had commanding views of the surrounding peaks, of the valleys far below, of the sky in all directions. It was a place for seeing and being seen, for conducting ceremonies that needed to be witnessed, for making observations that required unobstructed horizon views. The Inca had chosen this spot deliberately, had invested the labor to shape the stone with precision, had created something that served both practical and symbolic functions. Near the Intihuatana, Bingham identified what appeared to be an astronomical observation point or sundial platform. The area featured carved stone surfaces with specific orientations, structures positioned to allow sight lines to particular horizon points. Without years of observation, definitive interpretation was impossible, but the arrangement suggested deliberate astronomical alignment. The Inca understanding of astronomy was sophisticated, rivaling contemporary European knowledge in some aspects. They had tracked not just the sun but also the moon, certain stars, and possibly planets. They had understood that celestial patterns repeated, that they could be used to predict seasons, to time agricultural activities, to organize ceremonial calendars. While workers cleared vegetation and Bingham studied architectural features, the systematic documentation continued. Every wall was measured. Every building was drawn in plan view. Every significant feature was photographed from multiple angles. This work was tedious, demanding attention to detail and persistence through discomfort and fatigue. But it was essential. The value of Machu Picchu to scholarship depended on creating a reliable record that others could study, analyze, and build upon. The photographer faced particular challenges. Glass plate photography was an unforgiving medium. Each exposure needed to be precisely calculated, accounting for available light, the sensitivity of the photographic emulsion, the length of exposure time. Too little light or too short an exposure produced underexposed images, dark and lacking detail. Too much light or too long an exposure created overexposed images, washed out and equally useless. And there was no immediate feedback. The plates wouldn't be developed until later, back at base camp or even back in the United States. If mistakes were made, there would be no opportunity for retakes. Weather complicated photography immensely. Clouds moved constantly in the mountain environment, shade alternating with bright sun, creating dramatic lighting changes that required constant recalculation of exposure times. Rain threatened unexpectedly, forcing hurried protection of expensive, fragile equipment. Morning mist, while visually beautiful, diffused light in ways that made photography difficult. The photographer learned to work during the brief windows when conditions were optimal, to be patient when they weren't, to accept that some desired shot simply wouldn't be possible given the circumstances. Each glass plate was precious, representing not just monetary cost but also limited supply. The expedition had brought only so many plates. Once they were exhausted, no more photographs could be taken unless additional supplies were obtained, requiring weeks of travel to reach cities where photographic materials might be purchased. This scarcity forced careful selection of subjects. Every shot needed to count, needed to contribute to the documentary record in meaningful ways. The photographer developed strategies for maximizing value, taking multiple exposures of the most important features to ensure at least some usable images, while accepting that less critical subjects might receive only single shots or none at all. The physical challenges of photography at Machu Picchu were substantial. The camera was heavy, requiring strong arms and stable footing to position properly. The tripod had to be set up on uneven ground, often requiring improvisation to achieve level positioning. Access to desired vantage points frequently meant clambering over rough terrain while carrying delicate equipment. And all of this occurred at altitude where every physical exertion demanded more effort than it would at sea level. Developing the plates in field conditions added another layer of difficulty. The process required complete darkness, achieved by working inside a tent or under heavy cloth that blocked all light. Chemical solutions needed to be mixed in precise ratios and maintained at specific temperatures, challenging in an environment where temperatures fluctuated wildly between day and night. Water quality mattered, requiring filtration or careful selection of sources. The glass plates themselves were fragile, vulnerable to breakage during handling, during development, during subsequent transport. More than one precious image was lost to accidents that couldn't be prevented despite careful attention. Yet despite these challenges, the photographic archive that emerged was extraordinary. Hundreds of images captured Machu Picchu as it appeared in those first years after scientific discovery, before modern tourism, before extensive restoration work, before the site became world famous. These photographs became the foundational visual record, referenced by every subsequent researcher, reproduced in countless publications, serving as baseline documentation against which later changes could be measured. Harry Foote's surveying work was similarly demanding. Creating an accurate map required taking hundreds of measurements, establishing reference points, calculating angles and distances, accounting for elevation changes. The process was slow, methodical, requiring clear weather and multiple people working in coordination. One person would hold a measuring rod or sight target at a specific location. Another would take readings from surveying instruments. A third would record the data in field notebooks, carefully noting every measurement along with information about where and when it was taken. The terrain made surveying particularly challenging. Sight lines were often obstructed by walls, trees, or elevation changes. Moving equipment between measurement points meant navigating steep stairs, narrow passages, and areas where vegetation had been only partially cleared. The surveying instruments themselves were delicate, vulnerable to damage if dropped or knocked against stones. Yet Foote persisted, understanding that an accurate map would be invaluable for all future study of the site. The resulting map, while crude by modern standards, represented a major achievement. It showed the layout of major structures, the relationship between different sectors, the topography of the ridge, the location of terraces and water features. Future researchers could use this map to orient themselves, to understand descriptions of specific locations, to plan their own documentation and excavation work. Without Foote's patient surveying, much subsequent research would have been far more difficult. Bingham himself filled notebooks with observations, descriptions, and preliminary interpretations. His handwriting grew cramped as pages filled with details. Dimensions of structures. Observations about stonework quality. Notes about the relationships between different buildings. Sketches of floor plans and decorative elements. Questions to investigate further. Ideas about what various features might signify. His notebooks were working documents, not polished prose, characterized by abbreviations and shorthand that made perfect sense to him in the moment but might be cryptic when reviewed later. He was acutely aware that this documentation would form the basis for everything that followed. Articles would be written based on these notes. Books would draw from these observations. Other scholars would critique and challenge his interpretations based on the evidence recorded here. Accuracy was paramount. But so was comprehensiveness. Missing information couldn't be retrieved later. What wasn't documented now might be lost forever, particularly if the ruins deteriorated further or if vegetation reclaimed areas that had been temporarily cleared. The work continued for weeks, a steady rhythm of clearing, measuring, photographing, excavating, recording. Days began at dawn and extended until light failed. Meals were brief, functional affairs, food consumed as fuel rather than enjoyed for its own sake. Evenings were spent organizing the day's findings, planning the next day's priorities, discussing discoveries and puzzles with team members. Sleep came easily despite thin bedding and cool nights, exhaustion overriding discomfort. The local farmers who had been living at the site maintained their routines as best they could despite the disruption. Their crops still needed tending. Their children still played among the ruins. They were bemused by the intense interest these foreigners showed in old stones, but the work provided employment and the expedition paid fairly for labor and supplies, so there was no complaint. A kind of accommodation developed, parallel activities coexisting in the same space, each side largely staying out of the other's way. Richard and Alvarez occasionally shared stories about life at Machu Picchu. They spoke of snakes encountered in the undergrowth, of the challenges of farming on such steep terrain, of seasonal patterns in weather and wildlife. They mentioned that travelers sometimes passed through, usually prospectors searching for minerals or explorers like Bingham seeking ruins. Most visitors stayed briefly and moved on. The farmers themselves had no plans to leave, having invested years in clearing land and establishing their farms. The soil was fertile, the water supply reliable, and the isolation that made life difficult also provided a kind of freedom from official interference. Archaeological sites often yield artifacts, objects that provide direct evidence of how people lived. Pottery reveals cooking and storage practices. Tools indicate what kinds of work were done. Jewelry and decorative items reflect artistic sensibilities and social distinctions. Bingham hoped that excavation at Machu Picchu would produce a rich assemblage of artifacts that would help answer the questions the architecture alone couldn't resolve. The expedition conducted limited excavations, careful digging in areas that seemed promising. They explored caves that dotted the cliffs surrounding the site, spaces that might have been used for burials or storage or ceremonial purposes. They investigated structures that appeared to have been used for specific functions, buildings whose floor plans or features suggested they were something other than ordinary residencies. The caves proved particularly interesting. Many were natural formations that had been modified by human hands. Walls had been built to close off entrances or partition interior spaces. Floors had been leveled with fill and paving. Niches had been carved into rock faces to create storage alcoves or places for ceremonial objects. These modifications transformed natural caves into functional architectural spaces, extensions of the built environment that took advantage of features the landscape provided. Some caves showed clear evidence of having been used for burials. Human bones, scattered and fragmentary, lay among the rocks. In the humid environment, organic materials had mostly decayed, leaving only bone and teeth as evidence of the individuals once interred here. The burial practices weren't entirely clear from what remained. Had bodies been placed in the caves immediately after death, or had they been prepared elsewhere and only later interred in these locations? Had burials occurred during the site's occupation, or had some bodies been brought here later, perhaps by people who knew this had been a sacred place? The pottery fragments found in the caves and throughout the site were characteristic of Inca styles, confirming the cultural affiliation that the architecture already suggested. The ceramics showed certain decorative patterns and construction techniques that had been standardized across the Inca Empire, evidence of centralized control and shared cultural practices. But there were also local variations, subtle differences that suggested regional identity persisted within the broader imperial framework. Bingham collected pottery fragments carefully, noting where each piece was found, what depth it had been buried at, what it was found near. This contextual information was crucial for interpretation. A pottery fragment found on a floor surface might indicate the building's function. The same fragment found mixed with construction fill might simply indicate that broken ceramics had been incorporated as packing material. Without careful attention to context, artifacts could mislead as easily as they could inform. Stone tools were common finds. The Inca worked extensively in stone, not just for construction but for practical implements. Grinding stones for processing grain or other foods. Hammer stones for shaping other stones or for breaking apart raw materials. Blades for cutting meat or plant materials. The tools were functional rather than decorative, worn smooth by use, testifying to the daily labor that sustained the community. Bronze items, while less common than stone tools, were significant finds. Bronze was a valued material, an alloy of copper and tin that required metalworking knowledge and access to ore sources. The Inca produced bronze tools, weapons, and ornamental objects. At Machu Picchu, the bronze items recovered included pins used to fasten clothing, small knives, and decorative elements that might have been attached to textiles or wooden objects. The presence of bronze confirmed that this wasn't an isolated community cut off from broader trade networks, but rather a place connected to the empire's economic systems, with access to materials and goods that required long-distance exchange. But they didn't find gold or silver in any quantity. No magnificent treasures emerged from the earth. No ceremonial objects worked in precious metals, no elaborate jewelry, no ritual vessels that would have represented enormous wealth. This absence was itself informative. If Machu Picchu had been abandoned gradually, in an orderly fashion, then valuable items would have been taken by the departing population. Metal objects, particularly those made from gold or silver, were too valuable to leave behind. They represented accumulated wealth, status symbols, items that could be melted down and reworked into new forms. Only if a site had been abandoned suddenly, if inhabitants had fled in panic, might such valuables be left behind. The limited treasure made Bingham's work less spectacular from a public relations standpoint. Newspapers and magazines loved stories about golden artifacts emerging from ancient ruins. Such discoveries generated excitement, attracted funding, captured public imagination. A site with magnificent architecture but few portable treasures was harder to publicize, harder to use as justification for continued support. But from a scholarly perspective, the absence of treasure was simply another data point, another piece of evidence to consider when reconstructing Machu Picchu's history. The burial caves received extended attention. They offered the possibility of learning about the people who had lived at Machu Picchu, not just the structures they had built. In several caves, Bingham's team found skeletal remains of multiple individuals, suggesting these had been communal burial locations rather than individual tombs. The bones showed varying degrees of preservation depending on local moisture conditions and how exposed they had been to weathering and animal activity. Careful excavation and recording of these burials was essential. Each skeleton needed to be photographed in place before any bones were moved. Measurements needed to be taken. Associated artifacts needed to be noted. Only then could the remains be carefully collected for transport to Yale, where physical anthropologists with specialized training could conduct detailed analysis. The skeletal remains would eventually reveal important information. They showed that the buried population included individuals of various ages, from young children to elderly adults. They included both males and females, suggesting a resident community rather than a specialized group like soldiers or priests. The bones bore evidence of hard physical labor, with muscle attachment sites showing development consistent with people who carried heavy loads and engaged in strenuous activity throughout their lives. Dental wear patterns suggested a diet heavy in ground grain, probably maize, processed on stone grinding surfaces that left abrasive particles in the food. But extracting this information required laboratory facilities and expertise not available in the field. For now, Bingham could only collect the remains carefully and look forward to future analysis. Each skeleton represented a person who had lived at Machu Picchu, who had walked these paths, worked these terraces, participated in ceremonies in these temples. Their bones were evidence, but they were also memorials to lives lived centuries ago in circumstances we could only partially reconstruct. The excavations also revealed information about construction techniques and site development. Digging beneath building floors exposed foundation layers, showing how the Inca had prepared surfaces before construction. They found evidence of earlier structures beneath later ones, suggesting the site had been built in phases, with modifications and additions over time. This stratigraphic evidence would be valuable for establishing chronology, for understanding how Machu Picchu evolved from initial construction through final abandonment. In one area, excavation uncovered what appeared to be workshop debris, concentrations of stone chips and partially finished tools suggesting that craftsmen had worked in this location. The chips were granite, same as the building stones, indicating that at least some stone shaping had been done on site rather than all blocks being finished at distant quarries. This made practical sense. Why transport unnecessary weight up difficult trails when rough blocks could be carried to the site and then finished in place? As August progressed into September, as the documentation neared a kind of completion even if much remained to be done, Bingham had to confront the question that would define his relationship with Machu Picchu for the rest of his life. What had he found? Was this Vilcabamba, the lost capital he had come to Peru to discover? Was it something else, equally significant but differently important? And what, if anything, did this discovery mean for understanding Inca civilization more broadly? The Vilcabamba question was central because it had been the expedition's stated objective, the goal that had secured funding and institutional support. Bingham wanted this to be Vilcabamba. He needed it to be Vilcabamba. His academic reputation, his ability to secure future funding, his standing within Yale and the broader scholarly community, all of these depended on delivering results that matched the ambitious promises he had made when securing support for the expedition. Spanish chronicles described Vilcabamba as the final stronghold of the Neo-Inca state, the refuge where Manco Inca and his successors had resisted Spanish authority from 1537 until 1572. The descriptions emphasized the site's remoteness, its defensibility, its role as a functioning capital with administrative buildings, residences for nobility, and ceremonial spaces. Machu Picchu fit some of these criteria. It was certainly remote, certainly dramatic in its setting. But did it fit all the details? Were the architectural remains consistent with what would be expected from a rebel capital occupied for several decades in the mid-1500s? Bingham weighed the evidence obsessively, turning it over in his mind during the day, lying awake thinking about it at night. On the supporting side, the site's isolation and difficult access made it suitable for a refuge. The quality of construction suggested royal associations, indicated this was a place of high status and importance. The presence of ceremonial structures indicated this was a place where important religious and political functions had been performed. The size of the site could have accommodated a significant population, including nobility, priests, administrators, soldiers, and servants, all the people necessary for a functioning capital. On the questioning side, Spanish accounts of Vilcabamba mentioned certain specific features that weren't obvious at Machu Picchu. They spoke of a palace with thatched roofing, of particular churches the Spanish missionaries had built, of specific geographic relationships to nearby settlements. Bingham tried to reconcile these discrepancies, to explain them away as errors or misunderstandings in the Spanish accounts. But doubts persisted. And there was the chronology issue. If Machu Picchu had been occupied during the Neo-Inca period in the mid-1500s, there should be evidence of that occupation, artifacts or architectural features clearly datable to that era. Such evidence wasn't obvious, though Bingham convinced himself it might emerge with more thorough excavation. His natural optimism and the pressure to deliver significant results led Bingham toward identifying Machu Picchu as Vilcabamba. He convinced himself, or perhaps allowed himself to be convinced, that the fit was good enough. The problems with the identification could be explained by errors in the Spanish chronicles, by misunderstandings about geography, by the possibility that different chroniclers had been describing different locations within a broader complex of sites. In his preliminary reports, in conversations with team members, in letters sent back to Yale and to the National Geographic Society, he expressed confidence that they had achieved their primary objective. Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the lost capital rediscovered, a triumph of careful research, persistent effort, and fortunate timing. Not everyone shared his certainty. Some expedition members expressed doubts privately, though few challenged Bingham directly given his position as leader. The evidence wasn't as clear-cut as Bingham suggested in his public statements. Alternative interpretations seemed equally plausible, possibly more plausible. But Bingham was the expedition leader, the one who would write the official accounts, the one whose name would be associated with the discovery. His interpretation would carry weight simply because of his position and his prominence, regardless of whether other interpretations might eventually prove more accurate. Harry Foote, Bingham's close friend and fellow Yale faculty member, was probably the most openly skeptical. He questioned whether the architectural evidence really supported the Vilcabamba identification, whether the Spanish descriptions matched what they were seeing at Machu Picchu. But Foote's doubts were expressed in private conversations, intent discussions after long days of work, not in official reports that would be read by funding agencies and university administrators. He understood the pressures Bingham faced, the need to justify the expedition's costs and effort with significant findings. A tentative "maybe this is Vilcabamba" wouldn't satisfy sponsors the way a confident "we found it" would. In hindsight, from the perspective of later research conducted over subsequent decades, we know that Bingham was wrong about Vilcabamba. The actual location of the Neo-Inca capital was eventually identified elsewhere, at a site called Espiritu Pampa, considerably farther into the jungle, matching Spanish descriptions more accurately than Machu Picchu did. Machu Picchu predated the Neo-Inca period, had likely been constructed during the reign of the Emperor Pachacuti in the mid-1400s, and was probably abandoned before the Spanish even arrived in Peru. But these conclusions emerged only through extensive later work by other researchers who could build on Bingham's documentation while correcting his interpretive errors. In 1911, with limited time and resources, with pressure to produce significant findings, with a natural human desire to have made a major discovery, Bingham made the identification that seemed most likely and most advantageous to him. We can judge him for this, for allowing ambition to override caution, for claiming certainty where he should have expressed doubt. But we should also recognize the context in which he worked, the pressures he faced, the limitations of knowledge available at the time. Regardless of whether Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, its significance was undeniable, and Bingham deserves credit for recognizing this even if his specific interpretations were flawed. This was an extraordinarily well-preserved Inca site in a spectacular setting. The architecture alone made it remarkable, demonstrating engineering and aesthetic sophistication that commanded respect. The engineering evident in the terraces and water systems demonstrated advanced technical capabilities, showed that the Inca could solve complex problems without the tools and techniques Europeans considered essential. The site's layout revealed detailed planning and consistent execution over what must have been years or decades of construction effort. For scholars trying to understand Inca civilization, Machu Picchu offered a remarkable opportunity, a kind of time capsule showing how the Inca organized space, how they built to endure, how they integrated their structures with challenging topography. The site would teach archaeologists and historians lessons about Inca culture that couldn't be learned from Spanish chronicles or from less well-preserved ruins. In that sense, the specific question of whether this was Vilcabamba mattered less than the larger reality that Machu Picchu was an exceptional archaeological resource. The discovery would make Bingham's reputation, transforming him from a relatively obscure academic into an explorer whose name was known to the general public. It would secure his position at Yale, would lead to additional funding for more expeditions, would result in book contracts and lecture tours that would occupy much of the rest of his life. It would bring him celebrity status, with all the opportunities and complications that entailed. This celebrity had costs and benefits. It brought opportunities but also criticism. It generated public interest but also created pressure to maintain prominence through continued discoveries. Bingham's relationship with Machu Picchu would define much of the rest of his career, for better and worse. As clearing progressed and more of the site became visible, patterns emerged. The architecture wasn't uniform. Different areas featured different construction styles, different qualities of stonework. This variation told a story about the site's organization, about who had lived where, about hierarchies of importance and status. The finest stonework appeared in what Bingham began calling the Sacred District, the area around the Temple of the Three Windows and nearby structures. Here, stones were cut with incredible precision, surfaces polished smooth, corners meeting at exact angles. The blocks were large, many weighing several tons, yet they fit together so perfectly that even centuries of weathering hadn't opened significant gaps between them. This level of craftsmanship required exceptional skill, tools capable of shaping granite, an understanding of how to transport and position enormous weights, and most importantly, time. Creating such walls couldn't be rushed. Each block needed individual attention, needed shaping to match its neighbors exactly. In contrast, residential areas featured simpler construction. Stones were still fitted together competently, but with less precision, with rougher surfaces, with occasional use of mortar to fill gaps. This made perfect sense from a practical standpoint. Royal buildings or temples deserved the finest work, reflecting their importance in the social and religious hierarchy. Ordinary dwellings, while still solid and functional, didn't require the same level of craftsmanship. The differential investment of skill and labor communicated status, made hierarchy visible and tangible. Water management revealed additional sophistication. The site's water system consisted of a main channel that captured flow from a spring located approximately half a kilometer from the ruins. This channel, carefully engineered with the gradient necessary to maintain flow without creating erosion, delivered water to a series of 16 ritual fountains distributed throughout the urban sector. Each fountain featured a basin where water collected before overflowing into a channel that carried it to the next fountain in the sequence. The system demonstrated detailed planning and skilled execution. Water pressure needed to be maintained. The channels needed to be watertight. The fountains needed to be positioned to serve the population while also fitting into the site's ceremonial geography. Bingham found himself continually impressed by the hydraulic engineering. In a modern city, water systems are planned by specialists with sophisticated knowledge of fluid dynamics, of materials science, of construction techniques. The Inca achieved comparable results without the benefit of written mathematical notation, without metal tools capable of precise measurements, without wheels or pulleys or cranes. They worked with stone, wood, and bronze, with human and animal muscle power, with accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of builders. The results spoke to the power of empirical observation and trial and error. If a design worked, you repeated it. If it failed, you modified and tried again. Over centuries, this iterative process produced genuine expertise. The terraces posed their own engineering challenges. Building on steep slopes required creating flat surfaces where none naturally existed. This meant either cutting into the hillside or building up with fill, and typically both. A retaining wall would be constructed, strong enough to hold back tons of earth. Behind this wall, fill material would be added, a careful mix of rocks, gravel, sand, and topsoil, lead to provide drainage and prevent waterlogging. The surface would be leveled and planted. Over time, with proper maintenance, such terraces could remain productive for generations. But these terraces served purposes beyond agriculture. They also protected the site from erosion and landslides, constant threats in steep terrain with significant rainfall. The terraces functioned as a stabilization system, their retaining walls absorbing runoff energy, their drainage systems channeling excess water safely away. Without these engineered slopes, the entire site would have been vulnerable to collapse, particularly during the intense rains that came seasonally. The terraces weren't merely practical additions but essential components of the site's viability. As workers cleared different sections, unexpected discoveries emerged regularly. Here, a carved stone with intricate patterns whose meaning remained obscure. There, a building with unusual features, its floor plan different from others, suggesting some specialized function. Every discovery generated new questions, new avenues for investigation. And many questions had no clear answers. Without written records, without living witnesses who remembered the site in its functional period, interpretation relied on comparison with other Inca sites, on informed speculation, on archaeological evidence that was often ambiguous. One of the most intriguing structures was what became known as the Intihuatana stone, carved from a natural granite outcrop. The name meant hitching post of the sun in Quechua, though whether this reflected the stone's original purpose or represented later interpretation was unclear. The stone featured a central pillar rising from a carved base, with multiple angles and planes cut into the granite with geometric precision. Similar stones had been found at other Inca sites, suggesting they served important functions, possibly astronomical, possibly ceremonial, possibly both. The Inca were careful observers of celestial phenomena. They tracked the sun's movement throughout the year, noting solstices and equinoxes, understanding the relationship between solar position and agricultural cycles. Planting needed to coincide with seasonal patterns. Harvests needed to happen at optimal times. Ceremonial calendar was tied to astronomical events. An instrument that allowed precise solar observations would have been valuable, perhaps essential, for a culture so dependent on agricultural productivity. Bingham studied the Intihuatana intensely, taking measurements, photographing it from multiple angles, noting how shadows fell at different times of day. He consulted with team members who had stronger mathematical skills, who might be able to determine whether the stone's geometry encoded specific astronomical alignments. The question was fascinating but proving difficult to resolve with the time and tools available. Definitive analysis would require patient observation over an extended period, possibly a full year, to track the sun's complete annual cycle. As documentation progressed, as the site's features became clearer through accumulated evidence, Bingham began forming hypotheses about Machu Picchu's purpose. The quality of construction suggested this wasn't a common settlement but rather a place of special significance. The remote location implied deliberate choice, a desire for isolation or protection, or both. The terraces indicated agricultural self-sufficiency was important. The ceremonial structures pointed to religious functions. How did these elements combine into a coherent picture? One possibility was that Machu Picchu had served as a royal estate, a retreat for Inca nobility. Spanish chronicles mentioned that Inca rulers maintained multiple residences, palaces distributed throughout the empire where they could stay during travels or withdraw for rest and religious observances. A royal estate would explain the high-quality construction. It would explain the careful planning evident in the site's layout. It would explain the presence of both ceremonial spaces and residential areas, of agricultural terraces that could support a population including both nobles and their retainers. The mountain setting fit this interpretation. Inca rulers appreciated dramatic natural settings, building palaces in locations that demonstrated mastery over challenging environments. There was prestige in possessing an estate perched on a narrow ridge flanked by nearly vertical drops, accessible only via trails that tested physical endurance. Such a location communicated power, the ability to command resources sufficient to construct and provision an elaborate complex in what amounted to wilderness. But the royal estate hypothesis had complications. If this was a palace or retreat, whose palace was it? Which ruler had ordered its construction? Spanish chronicles didn't mention Machu Picchu by name, at least not in any accounts Bingham had read. This absence suggested either that the site predated the Spanish conquest and had already been abandoned by the time Europeans arrived, or that it was so remote and secret that chroniclers never learned of it. Either explanation seemed plausible but difficult to prove without additional evidence. Dating the site was proving difficult. Inca architecture had changed over time as building techniques evolved and as different rulers favored different styles. Expert archaeologists might be able to estimate construction dates based on stylistic analysis of the stonework, on the techniques used, on comparisons with sites whose dates were better established. But such analysis required expertise Bingham didn't possess and detailed documentation that couldn't be completed during the current expedition's brief window. There was also the possibility that Machu Picchu had religious significance, that it functioned as a sacred site, perhaps a pilgrimage destination or a temple complex where priests conducted important ceremonies. The Temple of the Three Windows and other ceremonial structures supported this interpretation. The Intihuatana stone suggested astronomical observations were important here. The location itself, high in the mountains, closer to the sky, to the sun, to the realm of the divine, carried spiritual meaning for Andean cultures both ancient and modern. Or perhaps Machu Picchu served multiple purposes. A royal estate could also function as a religious center. An Inca ruler might retreat here for spiritual renewal, might conduct ceremonies important to his political authority, might maintain a residence that was simultaneously palace and temple. The either-or thinking that characterized Western academic analysis might not apply to Inca culture, where political and religious authority were deeply intertwined, where rulers claimed divine descent and performed priestly functions. Bingham wrestled with these interpretations, testing them against the evidence, trying to find the explanation that best fit what he was observing. But he also recognized the limitations of his position. He was seeing Machu Picchu after centuries of abandonment, after the Inca Empire had been destroyed and its knowledge systems disrupted. He was interpreting through lenses shaped by his own cultural background, by assumptions about how societies organized themselves, by academic training that emphasized certain kinds of evidence and certain methodological approaches. The truth about Machu Picchu might be more complex than any single hypothesis could capture. Archaeological sites often yield artifacts, objects that provide direct evidence of how people lived. Pottery reveals cooking and storage practices. Tools indicate what kinds of work were done. Jewelry and decorative items reflect artistic sensibilities and social distinctions. Bingham hoped that excavation at Machu Picchu would produce a rich assemblage of artifacts that would help answer the questions the architecture alone couldn't resolve. The expedition conducted limited excavations, careful digging in areas that seemed promising. They explored caves that dotted the cliffs surrounding the site, spaces that might have been used for burials or storage or ceremonial purposes. They investigated structures that appeared to have been used for specific functions, buildings whose floor plans or features suggested they were something other than ordinary residencies. The artifact recovery was modest. They found pottery fragments, pieces of ceramic vessels that had been broken long ago. The fragments were characteristic of Inca styles, with certain decorative patterns and construction techniques that confirmed the site's general cultural affiliation. They found stone tools, implements used for cutting or scraping or grinding. They found bronze items, including pins that would have been used to fasten clothing. They found bone, some of it from animals that had been consumed as food, some of it possibly human, suggesting burial sites. But they didn't find gold or silver in any quantity. No magnificent treasures emerged from the earth. No ceremonial objects worked in precious metals. This absence was itself informative. If Machu Picchu had been abandoned gradually, in an orderly fashion, then valuable items would have been taken by the departing population. Metal objects, particularly those made from gold or silver, were too valuable to leave behind. They represented accumulated wealth, status symbols, items that could be melted down and reworked into new forms. Only if a site had been abandoned suddenly, if inhabitants had fled in panic, might such valuables be left behind. The limited treasure made Bingham's work less spectacular from a public relations standpoint. Newspapers and magazines loved stories about golden artifacts emerging from ancient ruins. Such discoveries generated excitement, attracted funding, captured public imagination. A site with magnificent architecture but few portable treasures was harder to publicize, harder to use as justification for continued support. But from a scholarly perspective, the absence of treasure was simply another data point, another piece of evidence to consider when reconstructing Machu Picchu's history. They did discover burial caves, locations where human remains had been interred. Inca burial practices varied depending on status and local tradition, but often involved placing the deceased in caves or constructed tombs, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes in seated positions, sometimes mummified through natural desiccation in dry environments. The burials at Machu Picchu showed signs of having been disturbed, possibly by earlier looters, possibly by the natural processes of decay and animal activity. Still, the presence of burials confirmed that people had lived and died here, that Machu Picchu wasn't merely a seasonal residence but a place with permanent or at least long-term inhabitants. Analysis of the skeletal remains would potentially reveal information about the population. Age at death, sex, health conditions, dietary patterns, all of these could be inferred from careful study of bones and teeth. Such analysis required laboratory facilities and specialized expertise not available in the field, so the remains were carefully packaged for transport back to Yale, where researchers with appropriate training could examine them properly. The excavations also revealed information about construction techniques. Digging beneath building floors exposed foundation layers, showing how the Inca had prepared surfaces before construction. They found evidence of earlier structures beneath later ones, suggesting the site had been built in phases, with modifications and additions over time. This stratigraphic evidence would be valuable for establishing chronology, for understanding how Machu Picchu evolved from initial construction through final abandonment. While workers cleared vegetation and Bingham conducted excavations, the systematic documentation continued. Every wall was measured. Every building was drawn in plan view. Every significant feature was photographed from multiple angles. This work was tedious, demanding attention to detail and persistence through discomfort and fatigue. But it was essential. The value of Machu Picchu to scholarship depended on creating a reliable record that others could study, analyze, and build upon. The photographer faced particular challenges. Glass plate photography was an unforgiving medium. Each exposure needed to be precisely calculated, accounting for available light, the sensitivity of the photographic emulsion, the length of exposure time. Too little light or too short an exposure produced underexposed images, dark and lacking detail. Too much light or too long an exposure created overexposed images, washed out and equally useless. And there was no immediate feedback. The plates wouldn't be developed until later, back at base camp or even back in the United States. If mistakes were made, there would be no opportunity for retakes. Weather complicated photography. Clouds moved constantly in the mountain environment, shade alternating with bright sun, creating dramatic lighting changes that required constant recalculation of exposure times. Rain threatened unexpectedly, forcing hurried protection of expensive, fragile equipment. Morning mist, while visually beautiful, diffused light in ways that made photography difficult. The photographer learned to work during the brief windows when conditions were optimal, to be patient when they weren't, to accept that some desired shot simply wouldn't be possible given the circumstances. Bingham himself filled notebooks with observations, descriptions, and preliminary interpretations. His handwriting grew cramped as pages filled with details. Dimensions of structures. Observations about stonework quality. Notes about the relationships between different buildings. Sketches of floor plans and decorative elements. Questions to investigate further. Ideas about what various features might signify. His notebooks were working documents, not polished prose, characterized by abbreviations and shorthand that made perfect sense to him in the moment but might be cryptic when reviewed later. He was acutely aware that this documentation would form the basis for everything that followed. Articles would be written based on these notes. Books would draw from these observations. Other scholars would critique and challenge his interpretations based on the evidence recorded here. Accuracy was paramount. But so was comprehensiveness. Missing information couldn't be retrieved later. What wasn't documented now might be lost forever, particularly if the ruins deteriorated further or if vegetation reclaimed areas that had been temporarily cleared. The work continued for weeks, a steady rhythm of clearing, measuring, photographing, excavating, recording. Days began at dawn and extended until light failed. Meals were brief, functional affairs, food consumed as fuel rather than enjoyed for its own sake. Evenings were spent organizing the day's findings, planning the next day's priorities, discussing discoveries and puzzles with team members. Sleep came easily despite thin bedding and cool nights, exhaustion overriding discomfort. The local farmers who had been living at the site maintained their routines as best they could despite the disruption. Their crops still needed tending. Their children still played among the ruins. They were bemused by the intense interest these foreigners showed in old stones, but the work provided employment and the expedition paid fairly for labor and supplies, so there was no complaint. A kind of accommodation developed, parallel activities coexisting in the same space, each side largely staying out of the other's way. As August progressed into September, as the documentation neared completion, Bingham had to confront the question that would define his relationship with Machu Picchu for the rest of his life. What had he found? Was this Vilcabamba, the lost capital he had come to Peru to discover? Was it something else, equally significant but differently important? And what, if anything, did this discovery mean for understanding Inca civilization more broadly? The Vilcabamba question was central because it had been the expedition's stated objective, the goal that had secured funding and institutional support. Bingham wanted this to be Vilcabamba. He needed it to be Vilcabamba. His academic reputation, his ability to secure future funding, his standing within Yale and the broader scholarly community, all of these depended on delivering results that matched the ambitious promises he had made. Spanish chronicles described Vilcabamba as the final stronghold of the Neo-Inca state, the refuge where Manco Inca and his successors had resisted Spanish authority from 1537 until 1572. The descriptions emphasized the site's remoteness, its defensibility, its role as a functioning capital with administrative buildings, residences for nobility, and ceremonial spaces. Machu Picchu fit some of these criteria. It was certainly remote, certainly dramatic in its setting. But did it fit all the details? Were the architectural remains consistent with what would be expected from a rebel capital occupied for several decades in the mid-1500s? Bingham weighed the evidence. On the supporting side, the site's isolation and difficult access made it suitable for a refuge. The quality of construction suggested royal associations. The presence of ceremonial structures indicated this was a place of importance. The size of the site could have accommodated a significant population, including nobility, priests, administrators, soldiers, and servants. On the questioning side, Spanish accounts of Vilcabamba mentioned certain features that weren't obvious at Machu Picchu. And there was the chronology issue. If Machu Picchu had been occupied during the Neo-Inca period, there should be evidence of that occupation, artifacts or architectural features datable to the mid-1500s. Bingham's natural optimism led him toward identifying Machu Picchu as Vilcabamba. He convinced himself, or perhaps allowed himself to be convinced, that the fit was good enough. In his preliminary reports, in conversations with team members, in letters sent back to Yale and to the National Geographic Society, he expressed confidence that they had achieved their primary objective. Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the lost capital rediscovered, a triumph of careful research, persistent effort, and fortunate timing. Not everyone shared his certainty. Some expedition members expressed doubts privately. The evidence wasn't as clear-cut as Bingham suggested. Alternative interpretations seemed equally plausible. But Bingham was the expedition leader, the one who would write the official accounts, the one whose name would be associated with the discovery. His interpretation would carry weight simply because of his position, regardless of whether other interpretations might eventually prove more accurate. In hindsight, from the perspective of later research conducted over subsequent decades, we know that Bingham was wrong about Vilcabamba. The actual location of the Neo-Inca capital was identified elsewhere, at a site called Espiritu Pampa. Machu Picchu predated the Neo-Inca period, had likely been constructed during the reign of the Emperor Pachacuti in the mid-1400s, and was probably abandoned before the Spanish even arrived in Peru. But these conclusions emerged only through extensive later work. In 1911, with limited time and resources, with pressure to produce significant findings, Bingham made the identification that seemed most likely and most advantageous to him. Regardless of whether Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, its significance was undeniable. This was an extraordinarily well-preserved Inca site in a spectacular setting. The architecture alone made it remarkable. The engineering sophistication evident in the terraces and water systems demonstrated advanced technical capabilities. The site's layout revealed detailed planning and consistent execution. For scholars trying to understand Inca civilization, Machu Picchu offered a remarkable opportunity, a kind of time capsule showing how the Inca organized space, how they built to endure, how they integrated their structures with challenging topography. The discovery would make Bingham's reputation. It would secure his position at Yale, would lead to additional funding, would result in book contracts and lecture tours. It would transform him from a relatively obscure academic into an explorer whose name was known to the general public. This celebrity had costs and benefits. It brought opportunities but also criticism. It generated public interest but also created pressure to maintain prominence through continued discoveries. Bingham's relationship with Machu Picchu would define much of the rest of his career, for better and worse. September brought a changing of seasons, subtle at this latitude but noticeable in weather patterns and light quality. The expedition's time was running out. They had accomplished much but could have used months or years more. There was still extensive clearing to do, more excavation to conduct, more thorough documentation to complete. But resources were finite. The team needed to return to the United States, to their academic positions, to the analysis and publication work that would give scholarly legitimacy to what they had found. The final days at Machu Picchu were bittersweet. Bingham walked through the site one last time, saying a kind of goodbye to stones that had become familiar. He knew he would return, was already planning return expeditions, but this first encounter was ending. He had arrived knowing nothing about this place, had spent weeks learning its contours and features, had begun to develop theories about its purpose and history. Now he was leaving, taking with him photographs, measurements, artifacts, and memories, but leaving behind the ruins themselves, returning them to the jungle's patient embrace. The descent to the river, the crossing of that precarious bridge, the journey back along the Urubamba, all of these felt different now. Bingham was departing not as a hopeful explorer but as someone who had achieved something significant. The uncertainty that had characterized the journey from Cusco weeks earlier had been replaced by confidence bordering on certainty. He had found something important. Now the task was to communicate that importance to the world, to convince funders and academic colleagues that Machu Picchu deserved continued attention and resources. The journey back to the coast, the voyage north along the Pacific, the eventual arrival in New York, these stages passed in a kind of blur. Bingham's mind was already focused on next steps. The photographic plates needed to be developed carefully. The artifacts needed to be catalogued and stored properly. The notebooks needed to be transcribed and organized. And then there was the writing, the formal presentation of findings that would establish the expedition's achievements in the scholarly record. His preliminary article appeared in Harper's Magazine in April 1913, presenting Machu Picchu to a general audience with dramatic photographs and exciting narrative. The response was enthusiastic. Readers were captivated by the images of ruins emerging from jungle, by the story of discovery, by the romance of lost civilizations and intrepid explorers. The National Geographic Society featured his work prominently, understanding its value for attracting members and generating public interest in exploration and research. Bingham became, almost overnight, a famous explorer, his name mentioned alongside those of adventurers who had explored Africa, the poles, or other remote regions. Academic publication came more slowly, subject to the peer review and editorial processes that govern scholarly journals. Bingham presented his findings at conferences, defending his interpretations against skeptical questions. Some colleagues were impressed. Others reserved judgment, wanting more evidence before accepting Bingham's claim that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba. Still others recognized the site's importance while questioning Bingham's specific conclusions about its purpose and chronology. This was normal academic discourse, the competitive exchange of ideas and evidence that characterized scholarly work at its best. But Bingham wasn't content with a single expedition. He knew that really understanding Machu Picchu would require sustained effort over multiple field seasons. he began planning return trips immediately upon his arrival back in the United States. And he succeeded in securing funding. The National Geographic Society, pleased with the public response to the initial discovery, provided support. Yale University, recognizing the prestige this work brought to the institution, allocated resources. Private donors, excited by the romance of archaeological discovery, contributed funds. Bingham returned to Machu Picchu in 1912 with a larger, better-equipped team. This second expedition focused on more extensive clearing and excavation. They brought proper archaeological tools, more photographic equipment, and enough personnel to conduct systematic work across multiple areas of the site simultaneously. The work continued for months, revealing more buildings, more artifacts, more details about how the site had been constructed and used. The 1912 expedition made significant progress in clearing vegetation from major structures. The Temple of the Sun became more fully visible, revealing its exceptional stonework and sophisticated design. The Royal Tomb, a cave that had been carefully shaped and finished beneath the temple, yielded important burial remains. The Intihuatana stone was cleared of surrounding growth, allowing detailed study of its geometry. The terraces were cleaned and measured, producing quantitative data about the site's agricultural capacity. They excavated more burial caves, recovering skeletal remains from over 100 individuals. These bones would be shipped to Yale for analysis, where physical anthropologists would study them for decades, extracting information about health, diet, age, sex, and ancestry. They found more artifacts, expanding the assemblage of pottery, tools, and metal objects. Each artifact was carefully catalogued, photographed, and packed for transport, destined for Yale's collections where they would be preserved and studied. The photographic documentation became more comprehensive. With more time and better understanding of the site's layout, photographers could plan shots systematically, ensuring coverage of all major features. They experimented with different lighting conditions, taking advantage of morning mist for atmospheric images, midday sun for detail shots, afternoon light for dramatic shadows. The resulting archive of photographs would become the definitive visual record of Machu Picchu in the early years after its scientific discovery. Bingham returned again in 1914 and 1915, each expedition building on previous work. By this point, much of the site had been cleared and documented. The focus shifted toward consolidation and analysis. What patterns could be discerned in the architecture? How did different sectors of the site relate to each other? What could the artifact assemblage reveal about the people who had lived here? These questions required careful study, comparison with other Inca sites, and theoretical frameworks for interpretation. The expeditions also faced growing complications. Peruvian authorities were beginning to question the export of artifacts to Yale. Cultural patrimony was becoming a political issue, with nationalist sentiments growing in Peru and other Latin American countries that had seen their archaeological heritage removed to foreign museums. Bingham navigated these tensions with varying success, sometimes obtaining proper permissions, sometimes operating in legal gray areas, sometimes facing criticism for practices that would later be condemned as exploitative. The relationship between Bingham and the Peruvian government would deteriorate over time, eventually resulting in demands for the return of artifacts, in legal disputes, in damaged reputations on both sides. These conflicts lay in the future as Bingham conducted his fieldwork in the 1910s, but they were already beginning to emerge as issues that would eventually need resolution. The ethics of archaeological practice were evolving, moving away from the treasure-hunting mentality that had characterized earlier exploration toward a more respectful approach that recognized the rights of source countries to control their cultural heritage. In the decades following Bingham's initial work, understanding of Machu Picchu deepened and in some cases changed significantly. Other researchers conducted additional excavations, applied new analytical techniques, developed alternative interpretations. The site became recognized as one of the most important archaeological locations in the Americas, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a symbol of Inca achievement that drew visitors from around the world. The identification of Machu Picchu as Vilcabamba was quietly abandoned as evidence accumulated that pointed elsewhere. The site's actual purpose remained debated. The royal estate hypothesis gained support from some scholars who analyzed the architecture and compared it to other Inca palaces. Others emphasized the religious dimensions, seeing Machu Picchu primarily as a sacred site. Still others developed more complex interpretations, viewing the site as serving multiple overlapping functions that couldn't be reduced to simple categories. Chronology became clearer as dating techniques improved. Radiocarbon dating, when applied to organic materials from the site, suggested construction began around 1450 CE, during the reign of Pachacuti, the emperor who expanded the Inca state from a regional power to an empire spanning much of West and South America. The site was probably occupied for less than a century before being abandoned, possibly due to the Spanish conquest and its disruptive effects, possibly for other reasons that remain unclear. The population who had lived at Machu Picchu became a subject of study. Analysis of skeletal remains from the burial caves suggested a diverse group, including people from different regions of the Inca Empire. This diversity supported interpretations of the site as a royal estate that drew inhabitants from across the empire, or as a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from distant areas. The bones also revealed information about health and living conditions, about diet and disease, about the physical demands of life in this challenging environment. The terraces received renewed attention as scholars recognized their importance not just for agriculture but for site stability and water management. Engineering analysis revealed sophisticated understanding of drainage, of load bearing, of how to build sustainably on steep slopes. The techniques used at Machu Picchu found applications in modern construction, ancient wisdom providing solutions to contemporary challenges. Tourism became both a blessing and a threat. Visitors flocked to see the ruins, generating economic benefits for Peru but also raising concerns about preservation. Foot traffic eroded paths. Tourists climbed on structures, accelerating deterioration. The sheer number of people visiting the site created logistical challenges and environmental impacts. Managing tourism while preserving the ruins emerged as a critical issue, one requiring careful planning and sometimes unpopular restrictions. Bingham himself never fully accepted corrections to his initial interpretations. He continued to maintain that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, defending this position even as evidence accumulated against it. This stubbornness damaged his scholarly reputation in some circles, marking him as someone too invested in his own theories to accept contradictory evidence. But his role as the person who brought Machu Picchu to international attention remained undisputed. Whatever errors he made in interpretation, whatever controversies surrounded his methods, he had accomplished something significant. He had recognized the site's importance, had dedicated resources to studying it, had created the documentation that made all subsequent research possible. The story of Hiram Bingham and Machu Picchu became woven into larger narratives about exploration, about cultural contact, about the recovery and preservation of heritage. It raised questions that remain relevant today. Who owns the past? Who has the right to study and interpret archaeological sites? What obligations do researchers have to the communities whose heritage they study? How should artifacts be preserved and displayed? These aren't abstract academic questions but practical, political issues with real consequences for how we understand history and culture. More than a century after Bingham's first glimpse of ruins emerging from jungle, Machu Picchu remains a place of mystery and wonder. The site has been extensively studied, photographed from every angle, walked by millions of visitors. Yet it retains its power to inspire awe, to generate questions, to resist complete understanding. The stones still stand, fitted together with precision that modern masons struggle to replicate. The terraces still cling to impossible slopes, testament to engineering skill. The views still command attention, mountains rising beyond mountains, clouds drifting through valleys, rivers rushing far below. We know more now than Bingham knew in 1911. We understand the chronology better, can place Machu Picchu more accurately within the timeline of Inca history. We have better interpretive frameworks, more nuanced understanding of Inca culture and society. We have technologies that allow us to study the site without invasive excavation, to see beneath the surface without digging, to reconstruct lost features through digital modeling. But mysteries remain. We don't know for certain why the site was built in such a remote location. We don't know exactly who lived there or for how long. We don't know why it was abandoned, whether the departure was sudden or gradual, planned or forced. We don't know what ceremonies were performed in the temples, what astronomical observations were made from the Intihuatana, what daily life was like for the inhabitants. The stones hold these secrets still, silent witnesses to a past that can be glimpsed but never fully recovered. Perhaps that enduring mystery is part of Machu Picchu's appeal. In an age when information seems readily available, when satellite imagery can show us anywhere on Earth, when databases catalog and categorize knowledge comprehensively, there's something compelling about places that resist complete understanding. Machu Picchu reminds us that the past is truly past, that the people who built these structures are gone, that their thoughts and motivations can be inferred but never known with certainty. For the visitor standing in the ruins today, looking out across those magnificent views, the experience connects across time to that July morning when Bingham first walked among these stones. The sense of discovery, of encountering something extraordinary, of standing at the intersection of human ambition and natural grandeur, these feelings transcend the particular historical moment. Machu Picchu in 1911 was different from Machu Picchu today in countless ways. But the fundamental power of the place remains constant. The Inca who built this citadel chose their location with care, seeking something more than mere utility. They could have built on easier ground, in more accessible locations. They chose instead to create something here, on this knife-edge ridge, flanked by peaks, suspended between earth and sky. That choice reflected values, aspirations, a worldview that saw the dramatic and difficult as worthy, that sought to create structures in harmony with overwhelming landscape, that understood the spiritual significance of high places. When Bingham stood here, overwhelmed by what he was seeing, trying to understand what he had found, he was experiencing the accumulated weight of those Inca choices, made centuries earlier by people whose names are lost to us. The stones they placed with such care had endured, had outlasted the empire that created them, had survived conquest and abandonment and the jungle's patient reclamation. And now those stones spoke, not in words but in their arrangement, in their presence, in the questions they posed to anyone willing to listen. And so we've walked with Hiram Bingham through his discovery of Machu Picchu, from that first difficult climb up from the Urubamba, through the weeks of documentation and excavation, through the subsequent expeditions and decades of study. We've seen how a chance conversation led to one of archaeology's most famous discoveries, how preparation met opportunity, how persistence turned possibility into achievement. The story reminds us that history isn't just what happened but also how we learn what happened, how we recover and interpret evidence, how we construct narratives from fragments. Bingham's work at Machu Picchu wasn't perfect. He made errors of interpretation, used methods that later scholars would criticize, operated with attitudes toward cultural patrimony that now seem problematic. But he also accomplished something remarkable, bringing international attention to a site that might otherwise have remained known only locally, creating documentation that enabled all subsequent research, helping to establish Inca archaeology as a serious scholarly field. The ruins still stand, much as they stood on that morning in 1911, much as they had stood for centuries before any outsider saw them. They will likely stand for centuries more, maintained now by preservationists, visited by tourists, studied by archaeologists who continue asking questions and developing new understanding. Machu Picchu belongs to the Inca who built it, to the Peruvian nation that protects it, to the scholars who study it, to the visitors who walk its paths, to all of us who wonder about the past and what it can teach us. Perhaps you'll find yourself thinking about these stones as you drift off tonight. Stones cut and shaped by hands long gone, fitted together with precision born of skill and patience, arranged to create something that endures. There's peace in that thought, in the idea that human work, done well and with care, can outlast the individuals who created it, can speak across the centuries to people who will listen. If these quiet explorations have brought you peace, if you've enjoyed this journey through time to a mountain citadel in Peru, consider letting others know by liking or subscribing. It helps more people find their way here, one sleepy mind at a time. For now, let the images fade gently. The terraces climbing impossible slopes. The precisely fitted stones. The windows opening onto mountain vistas. The mystery of why and how and for whom. Let it all drift into dreams as you settle into rest. The ruins will still be there tomorrow, patient as stone, waiting for the next person who climbs that trail and stands amazed among the clouds. Sleep well.